The moment Margaret Collins stepped off that Oregon train in 1887, every head turned, not in admiration, but in shock. At nearly 6 feet tall, she towered over the man who'd promised to marry her. Edward Price took one look, his face twisting with disgust. "I ordered a wife, not a giant," he spat, leaving her abandoned on the platform with nothing but a broken promise and the laughter of strangers. But Margaret didn't know that rejection would lead her to something far greater than she'd ever imagined. Stay with me to discover how one woman's perceived flaw became her greatest strength. And don't forget to comment your city below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The steam from the locomotive still hung in the October air when Margaret Collins first set foot on Oregon soil. She had traveled 3,000 miles from Boston, her heart full of hope, and her mind full of carefully rehearsed conversations she'd practiced during the long journey west. In her gloved hand, she clutched the bundle of letters that had brought her here. Letters from Edward Price, a successful sawmill owner who had painted pictures of partnership, prosperity, and a life built together in the thriving frontier town of Silver Creek. Margaret had memorized every word Edward had written. His penmanship had been precise, businesslike, each sentence constructed with the same care she imagined he applied to his lumber contracts. He described himself as a man of substance and ambition, 35 years old, established in business, seeking a refined Eastern woman to bring culture and grace to his frontier home. He'd asked about her education. She'd attended Radcliffe Seminary for 2 years before her father's death ended her studies. He'd inquired about her domestic skills. She could manage a household, speak French, play piano, and had won prizes for her needlework at the Massachusetts State Fair. He'd even asked about her temperament. She'd described herself as patient, industrious, and possessed of a quiet strength that had seen her through her family's financial ruin after the Panic of 1873. The one thing Edward Price had never asked about was her height, and the one thing Margaret had never thought to mention was that she stood 5 feet and 11 inches in her stocking feet. As she descended from the train car, her navy traveling dress impeccable despite the journey, her posture straight as her late mother had taught her, she scanned the crowded platform for the man whose photograph she kept in her locket. The image showed a serious-faced gentleman with dark hair and a well-trimmed beard, standing beside what appeared to be a desk in a photography studio. He'd looked respectable, solid, like the kind of man who kept his promises. "Miss Collins," the voice came from below her line of sight. Margaret looked down to see a man who barely reached her shoulder, his dark hair slicked back with pomade, his suit expensive but somehow diminished by the way he had to crane his neck to meet her eyes. This couldn't be Edward Price. The man in the photograph had seemed so much more substantial. "Mr. Price?" she ventured, though she already knew the answer from the way his expression was rapidly cycling through surprise, disbelief, and something that looked dangerously close to rage. "What in God's name—" Edward Price took a step back, his eyes traveling from her carefully arranged auburn hair down to her polished boots, measuring every inch of her height as if she were a tree he was considering for lumber. "You didn't mention you were a giant." The word hit Margaret like a physical blow, but she kept her composure. Years of being the tallest girl in every room had taught her to weather such comments with grace. "I am hardly a giant, Mr. Price. I am simply tall. You never inquired about my height in your letters." "Never inquired?" Edward's voice rose, drawing attention from other passengers and porters on the platform. "What man would think to ask such a thing? It's assumed a woman would mention if she were some kind of aberration." Margaret felt heat rising in her cheeks. "Aberration? Mr. Price, I am exactly as I described myself in my letters. Educated, capable, and willing to build a life here. My height doesn't change any of that." "Doesn't change?" Edward laughed, but it was an ugly sound, sharp and mocking. "Look around you, Miss Collins." Margaret did look. The platform was crowded with people going about their business, families reuniting, merchants collecting shipments, travelers heading into town. But now she noticed how many had stopped to stare. Men in work clothes nudged each other and pointed. Women in bonnets whispered behind gloved hands. Children gaped openly. "Do you see?" Edward continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're a spectacle. How am I supposed to establish myself as a man of importance in this town with a wife who towers over me like a lighthouse? What will my business associates think? What will the other wives say? Perhaps, Margaret said quietly, fighting to keep her voice steady, they will think you are a man confident enough to value character over appearance. Edward's face flushed red. Character? Miss Collins, marriage is a business arrangement, and you've misrepresented yourself. No man wants to look up at his wife. No man wants to be laughed at every time he walks down the street with her. I need a wife who makes me look like more of a man, not less of one. The cruelty of his words seemed to give courage to the onlookers. Someone in the crowd chuckled, then another. Soon, laughter rippled across the platform like a wave. "Send her back, Eddie," a rough voice called out. "Try ordering a smaller model." "Maybe she can work at your sawmill," another man shouted. "Bet she could fell trees with her bare hands." Edward's face grew even redder, but not from embarrassment on Margaret's behalf. He was embarrassed for himself for being associated with her even for these few moments. "I'll pay for your return passage," he said stiffly, reaching for his wallet. "There's a train heading east tomorrow morning. You can stay at the boarding house tonight." "No." The word came out stronger than Margaret intended, cutting through the laughter and chatter around them. Edward's hand froze halfway to his pocket. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no." Margaret straightened to her full height, no longer making any effort to minimize her stature as she'd learned to do in polite society. "I sold everything I owned to come here, Mr. Price. I burned every bridge back east on the promise of a new life, a promise you made in writing over the course of 6 months. I will not slink back in defeat because you lack the courage to stand beside a woman who happens to be tall." Edward's face contorted with fury. "Lack the courage? You deceived me. I omitted nothing that you asked about. If anyone has been deceived, sir, it is I. Your letters spoke of a man of character and substance. I see now that your character is as small as your stature, and your substance is nothing but pride and vanity." The crowd had grown quiet, watching this confrontation with the rapt attention usually reserved for prize fights or public hangings. Edward Price was not a man accustomed to being challenged, especially not by a woman, and certainly not in public. "You have no idea who you're speaking to," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I own the largest sawmill in Silver Creek. I employ half the men in this town. I could make your life here very difficult, Miss Collins." "Then it's fortunate I won't be staying," Margaret replied, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. Where would she go? She had $47 to her name, no return ticket, and no home to return to even if she could afford the passage. Edward seemed satisfied with this response. He straightened his jacket, attempting to reclaim some dignity. "The boarding house is 2 blocks north. Mrs. Henshaw runs a respectable establishment. Tell her to put the room on my account, 1 night only." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back with a cruel smile. "And Miss Collins?" A word of advice. "The next time you advertise yourself through the matrimonial news, you might want to mention your unusual proportions. Save some other poor fool the shock." He strode away through the crowd, which parted for him with the deference due to a man of his economic standing. Margaret stood alone on the platform, her single trunk at her feet, surrounded by strangers who regarded her with a mixture of pity and amusement. A woman with 3 small children clinging to her skirt shook her head as she passed. "Should have known better, a girl like you. Men want wives, not carnival attractions." Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her trunk, but she kept her chin high. She had survived the death of her parents, the loss of her family's fortune, the scorn of Boston society when she'd had to take work as a seamstress to support herself. She would survive this too. The trunk was heavy, packed with everything she owned. Her mother's china teacups wrapped in her few dresses, her father's books, the quilts her grandmother had made, her sewing supplies that had been her livelihood in Boston. She gripped the leather handle and began to drag it across the platform, ignoring the continued stares and whispers. "Let me help you with that." The voice was deep and came from someone actually taller than herself. Margaret looked up, a rare experience to see a man in logger's clothing, his flannel shirt rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle from years of hard work. He had sandy brown hair that caught the afternoon light and the bluest eyes she'd ever seen, like the deep pools of clear water she'd glimpsed from the train window as they'd passed through the Cascade Mountains. I can manage, Margaret said automatically, though the trunk was already making her arms ache. I'm sure you can, the man replied, and there was something in his tone that made her look at him more closely. There was no mockery in his expression, no pity either, just a straightforward offer of assistance from one person to another. But there's no shame in accepting help when it's freely offered. Thomas Hale, ma'am. I work at Jacobson's lumber camp about 5 miles north of town. Margaret hesitated. After Edward's cruelty, she was wary of trusting any man's kindness. But Thomas Hale stood patiently, not pressing, not assuming, just waiting for her to make her own choice. Margaret Collins, she said finally, releasing her grip on the trunk. And thank you, Mr. Hale. I would appreciate the assistance. Thomas lifted the trunk as if it weighed nothing at all, hefting it onto his broad shoulder. Mrs. Henshaw's boarding house, I'm guessing? It's the only respectable place for a lady in Silver Creek. You heard then. Ma'am, everybody within a mile heard. Thomas started walking, and Margaret fell into step beside him, noting with a strange pleasure that she only had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. He must have been at least 6 feet 3 inches tall. Edward Price never did have much sense when it came to anything beyond board feet and profit margins. You know him. Everyone knows Edward Price. He owns the biggest sawmill, which makes him think he owns the town too. Truth is, he's been trying to order a wife from back east for 2 years now. You're the first one who actually showed up. Margaret felt a flutter of alarm. There were others? 3, by my count. But they all had the sense to ask for photographs before making the journey. Thomas glanced at her, and there was something almost admiring in his expression. You must have had a powerful reason for leaving Boston to come all this way on nothing but promises. Margaret thought of the boarding house where she'd been living, 4 women to a room, all of them seamstresses working 16-hour days just to afford bread and rent. She thought of the marriage proposals she'd received in Boston, all from men who wanted to possess her like an exotic curiosity, or worse, men who saw her height as a challenge to be conquered and broken. Edward's letters had seemed like a door to a different life, one where she might be valued for her mind and capabilities rather than viewed as an oddity. I had my reasons, she said simply. They walked in companionable silence for a moment, passing storefronts and saloons, dodging horses and wagons in the muddy street. Silver Creek was exactly as Edward had described it in his letters, a boomtown rising from the Oregon wilderness, full of possibility and rough edges. The buildings were new construction, raw lumber still golden and fragrant with pitch. The streets were unpaved, turning to rivers of mud with every rain. Men far outnumbered women, groups of loggers and mill workers gathering outside saloons, even at this early hour of the afternoon. And every single person they passed stared at Margaret. Don't pay them any mind, Thomas said quietly. Folk here don't have much entertainment beyond gossip and whiskey. You're the most interesting thing to happen in Silver Creek since Johnson's pig got loose in the church during Easter service. Despite everything, Margaret found herself smiling slightly. And what happened to the pig? Oh, he found religion right quick when Reverend Dawson started chasing him with a hymnal. Never seen a pig move so fast or a reverend curse so colorfully, though he claimed later he was speaking in tongues. Margaret actually laughed then, a small sound but genuine, and Thomas grinned. There we go. That's better than letting Edward Price steal your smile along with your afternoon. They arrived at the boarding house, a 2-story structure painted white with green shutters, one of the more refined buildings in town. Thomas set Margaret's trunk on the porch and knocked on the door. Mrs. Henshaw appeared almost immediately, a small, round woman with gray hair pulled into a severe bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes traveled from Thomas to Margaret, taking in the full situation in an instant. So you're the bride Edward Price sent back, she said bluntly. Heard the commotion from here. That man's a fool, but I suppose you figured that out already. Mr. Price said I could have a room for tonight, Margaret began, but Mrs. Henshaw waved her hand dismissively. Oh, he'll pay for tonight, sure enough. He's too worried about his reputation to renege on that. But what about tomorrow? You have plans, girl? Margaret's silence was answer enough. Mrs. Henshaw sighed. Well, come in then. We'll sort something out. Thomas, bring that trunk up to the second room on the right. Miss Collins, you look like you could use some tea and common sense, and I can provide both. As Thomas carried her trunk upstairs, Mrs. Henshaw led Margaret into a small, neat parlor. The older woman poured tea from a china pot that reminded Margaret painfully of her mother's set, now packed in her trunk. "I won't lie to you, Miss Collins," Mrs. Henshaw said, settling into a chair with a creak of stays. "This town isn't kind to women who don't fit the mold. And you, my dear, broke that mold and threw away the pieces. But you're not the first woman to arrive here with one set of expectations, and have to make do with another reality entirely." "What do you mean?" "I mean that half the women in this town came here as mail-order brides, and most of us found something different than we were promised. My own husband, God rest his soul, described himself as a successful merchant. Turned out he ran a trading post that was 2 boards and a dream. But we made it work, built something real together before the fever took him 5 years ago." Thomas returned, pausing in the doorway. "Trunk's in your room, Miss Collins." "Mrs. Henshaw, you need anything else?" "Sit down, Thomas Hale," Mrs. Henshaw commanded. "You're not fooling anyone hovering there like a guilty schoolboy. You want to help Miss Collins, don't you?" Thomas's ears reddened slightly, but he took a seat. "Just seems wrong, leaving a lady stranded because she's got a few inches on Edward Price. Man's got an ego more fragile than spun glass." "The question," Mrs. Henshaw said, fixing Margaret with those sharp eyes, "is what you mean to do now. You could take Edward's money and go back east. No shame in that." "There's nothing for me back east," Margaret admitted. "I sold everything, told everyone I was getting married and starting fresh. I can't go back to that boarding house, that life." She set down her teacup, squaring her shoulders. "I'm a fair seamstress. Perhaps I could find work here." Mrs. Henshaw and Thomas exchanged glances. "Silver Creek's got exactly one seamstress," Thomas said slowly. "Mrs. Patterson, who also happens to be Edward Price's sister. She won't take kindly to competition, especially from you." Margaret's heart sank. Of course, Edward's reach would extend that far. "But," Mrs. Henshaw said thoughtfully, "there's mending work plenty. These loggers and mill workers are hell on clothes, pardon my language, and most of them can't sew on a button to save their lives. You wouldn't have a shop, but you could work from here. I've got a sunroom going unused. Set you up with a table and chair, good light for needlework. You'd let me stay? Room and board for 30% of your earnings, plus you help with the household chores. It's not charity. I could use the help, and Lord knows these men need someone who can properly darn a sock." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. After Edward's cruelty, this practical kindness was almost overwhelming. "Mrs. Henshaw, I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet. This won't be easy. Edward Price doesn't like being embarrassed, and you embarrassed him good today. He'll make things difficult if he can." "Let him try," Thomas said quietly. And there was something in his tone that made both women look at him. "Begging your pardon, but Edward Price doesn't own this town as much as he thinks he does. There are plenty of us who work for other outfits, shop at other stores. Miss Collins wants to make a go of it here. She'll find friends." "Why?" Margaret asked, genuinely puzzled. "Why would you help me?" "You don't know me at all." Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "My mother was tall," he said finally. "Not quite as tall as you, but close. Back in Minnesota, before we came west, I watched how people treated her, the comments, the stares, the way men acted like her height was somehow an insult to them personally. She used to slouch, trying to make herself smaller, until my father told her to stand tall and be damned to anyone who didn't like it." He stood up, towering over both women. "You stood tall today, Miss Collins, even when Edward Price tried to make you feel small. That takes courage. This town could use more of that kind of courage." Margaret looked up at this giant of a man with his kind blue eyes and work-roughened hands, then at Mrs. Henshaw with her sharp practicality and generous spirit. They were strangers, both of them, yet they'd shown her more genuine human decency in the past hour than Edward Price had in 6 months of correspondence. "Then I'll stay," she said firmly. "I'll work, I'll earn my keep, and I'll show Edward Price that rejecting me was the best thing that could have happened to me." Mrs. Henshaw smiled, the expression transforming her stern face. "That's the spirit! Now, Thomas, stop mooning and go fetch Miss Collins some supper from the kitchen. Girls had nothing but train food for days, I'd wager. And Margaret, I may call you Margaret, you and I need to discuss the practical matters. This town's got rules, written and unwritten, and if you're going to survive here, you need to know them all. As Thomas headed to the kitchen, Margaret felt something she hadn't expected to feel when she'd stood abandoned on that train platform. Hope. It wasn't the future she'd planned, wasn't the life Edward Price had promised in his letters, but perhaps it could be something better. A life built on truth rather than pretense, on courage rather than convention. Outside, she could hear the sounds of Silver Creek continuing its daily business, the distant scream of sawmills, the shouts of workers, the rumble of wagons over rutted streets. Tomorrow, she would face it all, the stares, the whispers, Edward Price's inevitable attempts to drive her out. But tonight, she had tea and kindness and the beginning of what might become friendship. Margaret Collins had come to Oregon to find a husband. Instead, she'd found something rare and more valuable, the chance to discover who she really was when she stopped trying to make herself smaller for the comfort of small-minded men. The sun was setting over the Cascade Mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Through the parlor window, Margaret could see the forest that pressed close to the edges of town, tall pines reaching toward the heavens without apology for their height. She thought of Thomas's mother, told to stand tall and be damned. She thought of her own mother, who'd spent her life apologizing for taking up too much space. "Mrs. Henshaw," Margaret said suddenly, "I need you to know something. I won't apologize for my height. Not anymore. If that's going to be a problem—" "Girl," Mrs. Henshaw interrupted, "the only problem I have is with folks who think they get to decide what's proper and what's not based on their own narrow minds. You stand as tall as God made you, and anyone who doesn't like it can find somewhere else to get their socks darned." Thomas returned with a tray laden with food, thick stew, fresh bread, apple pie that smelled of cinnamon. He set it down in front of Margaret with a gentle smile. "Welcome to Silver Creek, Miss Collins," he said. "It's not perfect, but for those willing to work and stand their ground, it can be home." As Margaret ate the first real meal she'd had in days, listening to Mrs. Henshaw outline the geography of the town's social landscape and watching Thomas add quiet observations from his corner chair, she thought about the word home. She'd thought she was coming to Oregon to find it ready-made in Edward Price's promises. Now she understood she would have to build it herself, one mended shirt and darned sock at a time, standing tall despite those who would rather see her shrink. The thought should have been daunting. Instead, for the first time since stepping off that train, Margaret Collins felt free. Edward Price had released her from his expectations, and in doing so, had inadvertently given her the gift of possibility. She could be exactly who she was here, without pretense or apology. Tomorrow would bring challenges. But tonight, in this boarding house with these unexpected allies, Margaret began to believe that being rejected might have been the best thing that ever happened to her. Edward Price had wanted a wife who would make him look bigger. Instead, he'd set free a woman who would never again make herself smaller for anyone. The story of Margaret Collins in Silver Creek had not ended on that train platform. It had only just begun. The morning after her arrival dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of persistent Oregon rain that Margaret would soon learn could last for weeks. She woke in the small but clean room Mrs. Henshaw had provided, momentarily disoriented before the events of yesterday came rushing back. The humiliation on the platform, Edward Price's cruel rejection, and then the unexpected kindness of strangers. She dressed carefully in her simplest work dress, a brown wool that had seen better days but was perfectly suitable for her new circumstances. Downstairs, the boarding house was already alive with activity. Mrs. Henshaw kept 4 other boarders besides Margaret, all men who worked at various lumber camps and mills around Silver Creek. They sat around the large kitchen table, attacking plates of flapjacks and bacon with the enthusiasm of men who earned their bread through physical labor. The conversation died the moment Margaret entered the room. 4 pairs of eyes turned to stare at her, and she could practically hear their thoughts. This was the woman Edward Price had rejected, the giant bride, the spectacle from the train platform. "Gentlemen," Mrs. Henshaw said sharply, "mind your manners. This is Miss Collins, our new boarder. She'll be doing mending and alterations from the sunroom, so if any of you need work done on your clothes, which, looking at the state of you, is all of you, you'll treat her with respect or you'll find yourself looking for new lodgings." One of the men, younger than the others with a shock of red hair, grinned. No disrespect meant, ma'am. Just surprised is all. Edward Price must need spectacles if he couldn't see what a fine-looking woman you are, tall or not. That's enough, Patrick, Mrs. Henshaw warned, but Margaret caught the twinkle in her eye. Miss Collins doesn't need your Irish charm this early in the morning. Margaret took her place at the table, noting that even seated, she was taller than most of the men. Patrick the Irishman didn't seem bothered, but an older man with graying whiskers kept glancing at her nervously, as if she might suddenly grow even taller. I understand you work at the lumber camps, Margaret said, determined to establish herself as more than just an oddity to be stared at. That must be dangerous work. Dangerous enough, Patrick agreed, showing her his left hand where 2 fingers were missing. But it pays well, and that's what matters out here. You planning to stay long in Silver Creek, Miss Collins? As long as it takes to establish myself, Margaret replied evenly. I'm a seamstress by trade, and I intend to build a business here. The older man snorted. Good luck with that. Edward Price's sister has all the decent ladies' business sewn up tight. And after yesterday. After yesterday, what? Margaret challenged, meeting his eyes directly. The man shifted uncomfortably. Just saying Price has a long memory and a longer reach. He won't take kindly to you setting up shop in his town. It's not his town, Thomas Hale's voice came from the doorway. He entered, having to duck slightly under the frame, rain dripping from his coat. Morning, Mrs. Henshaw. Miss Collins. Boys. The atmosphere in the room shifted with Thomas's presence. The other men straightened slightly, and even the skeptical older man stopped his grumbling. Thomas commanded respect, Margaret realized, not through wealth or position like Edward Price, but through something more fundamental, strength of character that everyone recognized. Thomas Hale, what are you doing here so early? Mrs. Henshaw demanded, but she was already reaching for another plate. Camp's 5 miles north. Had business in town, Thomas said vaguely, taking a seat across from Margaret. Thought I'd stop by, see how Miss Collins is settling in. Margaret felt warmth rise in her cheeks. That's very kind of you, Mr. Hale, but I'm quite capable of managing on my own. Never said you weren't, Thomas replied mildly, accepting the plate of flapjacks Mrs. Henshaw set before him. But having friends never hurt anyone's chances. Speaking of which, I talked to some of the boys at camp last night. Between Jacobson's outfit and the Clearwater crew, that's near about 300 men who could use mending services. Patrick whistled low. That's a lot of torn breeches and missing buttons. That's a living, Thomas corrected, looking directly at Margaret. If you're interested, I could put the word out. The men could bring their mending when they come to town on Saturdays. Before Margaret could respond, the front door of the boarding house slammed open with such force it rattled the windows. Edward Price stood in the doorway, rain streaming off his expensive coat, his face flushed with anger. Where is she? He demanded, then spotted Margaret at the table. You were supposed to leave this morning. Mrs. Henshaw stood slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. Mr. Price, this is my establishment, and you'll not come barging in here like you own it. I paid for one night, Edward snarled. One night only. And that night's not up until noon, Mrs. Henshaw replied calmly. Besides, Miss Collins has made other arrangements. She's my new boarder, and she'll be providing mending services for the working men of this town. Edward's face darkened further. Mending services? I think not. My sister runs the only respectable tailoring business in Silver Creek. Your sister, Margaret said, standing to her full height, serves the ladies of Silver Creek. I'll be serving the working men who need practical repairs. There's no competition there. You won't get a single customer, Edward threatened. I'll make sure of it. Will you now? Thomas stood as well, towering over Edward by nearly a foot. The size difference was almost comical, but there was nothing funny about the tension crackling between the two men. And how do you plan to do that, Price? You going to forbid every logger and mill worker in town from getting their clothes mended? The men who work for me will do as I say. The men who work for you make up less than a quarter of the workers in this area, Thomas pointed out. Plenty of us work for other outfits. Jacobson, Clearwater, Murray's crew up north. You don't own us, and you don't own this town. Edward's hands clenched into fists. You're making a mistake, Hale. Throwing your lot in with this... Careful, Thomas warned, his voice dropping dangerously low. "Choose your next words very carefully, Price." The two men stared at each other for a long moment. The other boarders had gone completely still, flapjacks forgotten, watching the confrontation with wide eyes. This was more than just about Margaret, she realized. This was about something deeper, a conflict between Edward Price's assumed authority and the growing resentment of those he considered beneath him. Finally, Edward took a step back, his lips curling in an ugly smile. "You want to champion this freak show, Hale? Fine. But don't come crying to me when it all goes wrong. And you," he pointed at Margaret, "you'll regret not taking my offer of passage home. This town will chew you up and spit you out." He stormed out, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the dishes on the table. Patrick let out a long breath. "Well, that was interesting. Haven't seen anyone stand up to Price like that ever, actually." The older man shook his head. "You've made an enemy there, miss. Edward Price doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive." "Then it's a good thing I'm not asking for either," Margaret replied, though her hands trembled slightly as she sat back down. Thomas resumed his seat as well, calmly returning to his flapjacks, as if he hadn't just faced down one of the most powerful men in town. "Don't let him scare you, Miss Collins. Price talks big, but he's not the only game in town. You do good work, treat people fair, you'll have customers." Mrs. Henshaw began clearing plates with perhaps more vigor than necessary. "Thomas is right. Half this town is waiting for someone to knock Edward Price down a peg or two. You standing up to him yesterday, and now Thomas backing you. It's given people something to talk about besides lumber prices and the weather." Over the next few hours, Margaret set up her workspace in the sunroom. It was perfect for her needs, bright despite the cloudy day, with windows on 3 sides and enough space for her sewing table and supplies. She unpacked her precious tools, her mother's silver scissors, the thimble her grandmother had used, needles and thread in every color, buttons and patches saved from years of work in Boston. She had barely finished arranging everything when her first customer appeared at the door. It was Patrick, the red-headed Irishman from breakfast, holding a shirt that appeared to be more whole than fabric. "Got caught on a saw last week," he explained sheepishly. "Been meaning to get it fixed, but—" He trailed off, clearly embarrassed. Margaret examined the damage with professional eyes. "I can repair this, but it'll be visible. Unless—" She considered for a moment. "I could reinforce the entire front panel, make it stronger than before. It would actually last longer in your line of work." Patrick's face lit up. "You could do that. How much?" They negotiated a fair price, and Margaret set to work. As she sewed, Patrick talked, seeming not at all bothered by her height now that they were both seated. He told her about coming from Ireland 3 years ago, about the camps and the dangerous work, about the dreams all the men had of striking it rich or saving enough to bring sweethearts from back home. "Course, most of us just spend it on whiskey and cards," he admitted with a self-deprecating grin. "But Thomas, now, he's different. Been saving every penny for 5 years. Plans to buy his own land, start his own lumber operation. He's got the brains for it, and the men would follow him to hell and back." Margaret kept her eyes on her needlework, though her ears perked with interest. "He seems very capable." "Capable?" Patrick laughed. "Miss, Thomas Hale could run this whole town if he wanted. Only reason he doesn't is he can't stand politics and nonsense. Straight as an arrow, that one. Never seen him look twice at any of the sporting girls neither, though Lord knows they've tried." "Patrick," Mrs. Henshaw's voice came sharp from the doorway. "Miss Collins doesn't need to hear about sporting girls." Patrick's face went red as his hair. "Begging your pardon, miss. Sometimes I forget I'm not in the camps." Margaret surprised herself by laughing. "No offense taken, Mr. O'Brien. I may be from Boston, but I'm not made of glass." Word spread quickly that Margaret was taking mending work. By afternoon, despite the rain, a steady stream of men had come to the boarding house. Some came out of genuine need, shirts torn by saw blades, trousers ripped by rough work, coats with buttons missing. Others, she suspected, came out of curiosity, wanting to see the tall woman who'd stood up to Edward Price. She treated them all with professional courtesy, discussing repairs and prices without acknowledging the stares or occasional whispered comments. Several times she heard variations of "bigger than my wife" or "could probably lift a full-grown man," but she kept her attention on her work. Late in the afternoon, when the rain had finally stopped and weak sunlight filtered through the windows, a different sort of visitor arrived. Three women entered the sunroom, all dressed in the latest fashion despite the muddy streets outside. Margaret recognized the type immediately, the society ladies of Silver Creek, such as it was. The leader of the group was clearly Edward Price's sister. She had the same dark hair and sharp features, though on her they were softened by expensive clothing and careful grooming. She looked Margaret up and down with undisguised disdain. "So you're the giant Edward rejected," she said without preamble. "I'm Mrs. Eleanor Patterson. I run Patterson's Fine Tailoring, the only respectable establishment for ladies' clothing in Silver Creek." Margaret stood, forcing Mrs. Patterson to crane her neck to maintain eye contact. "Miss Margaret Collins, I understand you serve the ladies of the town. I have no intention of competing for that business." "No, you've set your sights on the men instead." Eleanor's tone was acid. "How appropriate for someone of your dimensions." One of the other women tittered behind her gloved hand. Margaret felt heat rise in her face, but kept her voice steady. "I'm providing a necessary service for working men who need practical repairs. Nothing more." "Nothing more?" Eleanor stepped closer, though she barely reached Margaret's shoulder. "You arrive in town under false pretenses, humiliate my brother, and then have the audacity to stay and set up shop? You should be ashamed." "The only shame," Margaret replied quietly, "is that your brother values appearance over character. If that's a family trait, then I pity you both." Eleanor's face flushed an ugly red. "How dare you? What's going on here?" Thomas's voice interrupted from the doorway. He had to duck to enter, his presence immediately filling the small room. "Ladies, Miss Collins." Eleanor Patterson's demeanor changed instantly in Thomas's presence, her harsh expression softening into something almost simpering. "Mr. Hale, how lovely to see you." "I was just explaining to Miss Collins that Silver Creek has certain standards. The only standard I care about," Thomas interrupted calmly, "is good work at a fair price. Miss Collins provides both. Now, if you ladies have business here, state it. Otherwise, I believe you're interrupting her workday." Eleanor's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. The other women exchanged nervous glances. It was clear that Thomas Hale's opinion carried weight, even with the society ladies of Silver Creek. "We were just leaving," Eleanor said stiffly, "but this isn't over. My brother won't stand for this insult." After they swept out in a rustle of silk and indignation, Thomas turned to Margaret. "You all right?" Margaret realized her hands were trembling slightly. "Yes, thank you, though I'm beginning to wonder if your defense of me will cause you trouble." Thomas shrugged his massive shoulders. "Price has been needing someone to stand up to him for years. Might as well be now." He pulled a bundle from inside his coat. "Speaking of which, brought you some work from the camp." The boys were too shy to come themselves, but they need things mended. The bundle contained over a dozen items, shirts, trousers, even a few coats. It represented hours of work and good money. Margaret looked up at Thomas with genuine gratitude. "Why are you doing this?" "Really?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "You know what it's like working in the camps? Every day, you're judged on what you can do, not what you look like or where you came from. A man could be ugly as sin, but if he can handle an axe and pull his weight, he's respected. Seems to me the rest of the world could learn from that." He paused, then added more quietly, "Besides, I know what it's like to not fit in. Being bigger than everyone else isn't always easy either. People make assumptions, expect you to be a certain way. Sometimes it's nice to meet someone who understands that." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude for the work he'd brought. "Thank you, Mr. Hale. That means more than you know." "Thomas," he corrected. "If we're going to be friends, might as well use first names." "Then you must call me Margaret." He smiled, and it transformed his rugged face into something almost boyish. "Margaret it is. I'll be back Saturday with more work from the camps. Oh, and there's a town social at the church Sunday evening, dancing and such. You should come." Margaret's stomach dropped. "I don't think that would be wise. After today." "Especially after today," Thomas insisted. "Show them you're not going anywhere. Show them you belong here as much as anyone." After he left, Margaret sat in the fading light of the sunroom, surrounded by the work he'd brought. Each torn shirt and ripped trouser represented acceptance, or at least the beginning of it. She picked up her needle and began to sew, her stitches precise and strong. Mrs. Henshaw found her there an hour later, still working by lamplight. "You missed supper." "I wanted to finish this shirt." "Patrick needs it for tomorrow." The older woman sat down across from her, studying Margaret with those sharp eyes. "Thomas Hale's a good man." "Yes, he's been very kind." "Kind?" Mrs. Henshaw snorted. "Child, that man walked 5 miles in the rain to check on you this morning, then spent his whole day off making sure you had work and protection. That's not kindness. That's something else entirely." Margaret kept her eyes on her sewing. "He's just being helpful." "If you say so. But I've lived long enough to know when a man's smitten, and Thomas Hale is smitten something fierce. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Margaret didn't answer because she didn't know. She'd come to Silver Creek to marry Edward Price, to build a life as a respectable wife. Now she was a single woman taking in mending, making enemies of the town's most powerful family, and possibly developing feelings for a lumberjack who made her feel small and protected despite her unusual height. The next few days fell into a pattern. Margaret rose early, helped Mrs. Henshaw with breakfast, then spent her days in the sunroom, her needle flying through fabric. Word had indeed spread through the camps, and men came steadily with work. Some were rough and barely civilized, others surprisingly gentle and soft-spoken. All of them treated her with a careful respect that she suspected had more to do with Thomas's protection than her own merit, but she'd take it. Edward Price made his presence felt in small, petty ways. The general store suddenly had no thread in stock when Margaret went to buy supplies, though she could see bolts of it behind the counter. The butcher claimed to be out of the cut of meat Mrs. Henshaw had ordered for the boarding house. The postmaster lost Margaret's letter to Boston 3 times before she gave up trying to send it. But for every door Edward closed, others opened. The owner of the smaller mercantile, a competitor of the general store, made sure Margaret had all the supplies she needed at fair prices. The German butcher who Edward had snubbed for not speaking perfect English saved the best cuts for Mrs. Henshaw. And the men from the camps not only brought their mending, but began bringing small gifts, a handful of wild berries, interesting stones from the river, once even a roughly carved wooden thimble that was impractical but touching in its intent. Saturday came clear and bright, one of those perfect autumn days when the Oregon sky seemed impossibly blue and the mountains stood out sharp against the horizon. The town was busier than usual with workers coming in from the camps, and Margaret's sunroom was crowded with men dropping off or picking up mending. She was negotiating with a particularly difficult customer, a foreman who thought her prices too high, when she heard a commotion outside. Through the window, she could see a crowd gathering in the street. "Fire!" someone shouted. "The old storehouse is burning!" Everyone rushed outside. Indeed, smoke was rising from a building 2 blocks away, black and ominous against the clear sky. Men were already forming a bucket brigade, and Margaret watched as the town came together in crisis. Edward Price's men working alongside Thomas's crew from Jacobson's camp. "We need more hands," someone called, and without thinking, Margaret stepped forward. "I can help." The man looked at her skeptically. "This is men's work, miss." "I'm stronger than I look," Margaret insisted, taking a bucket from the line. The man shrugged and let her join. For the next hour, Margaret worked alongside the men, passing buckets with an efficiency born of desperation. Her height was actually an advantage. She could reach across gaps that others couldn't, keeping the line moving smoothly. Her dress was soaked, her hands blistered, but she didn't stop until the fire was finally controlled. As the smoke cleared and people began to disperse, Margaret noticed the crowd was looking at her differently. Not with mockery or curiosity, but with something approaching respect. She'd proven herself in a way that mattered here, through hard work in a crisis. "Not bad for a city girl," Patrick said, grinning through the soot on his face. "Though you might want to do something about—" He gestured vaguely at her. Margaret looked down. Her dress was ruined, soaked and singed. Her hair had come completely undone and hung in wet strings around her face. She was covered in soot and ash. She must have looked a fright. "You look like a warrior," Thomas's voice said quietly beside her. "Like something out of those old Viking stories." She turned to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, admiration mixed with something deeper, more intense. "I must look terrible," she said, suddenly self-conscious. "You look like someone who saw a job that needed doing and did it," Thomas replied. "That's the best kind of beautiful there is." Before Margaret could respond, Edward Price's voice cut through the moment. "Miss Collins!" He was striding toward them, his face furious despite the successful firefighting effort. "What were you thinking? This was no place for a woman. This was no place for anyone too proud to get their hands dirty," Thomas interrupted. "Margaret did more work than half the men here. Where were you, Price? I didn't see you on the bucket line." Edward's face went red. "I was organizing the effort. You were standing back giving orders while others did the work," someone called from the crowd. "The lady pitched in. That's worth something." A murmur of agreement went through the gathered townspeople. Margaret realized this was a turning point. The fire had given her a chance to prove herself not as a curiosity or an oddity, but as someone willing to work for the community. "This changes nothing," Edward said coldly. "One afternoon doesn't make her welcome here." "Doesn't make her unwelcome either," Mrs. Henshaw said, pushing through the crowd with a blanket that she wrapped around Margaret's shoulders. "Seems to me she's proven she's got more spine than some who were born here." That evening, after Margaret had bathed and changed into her one remaining good dress, Thomas came to the boarding house. He was cleaned up too, his hair still damp, wearing what she suspected were his best clothes. "Thought you might like to take a walk," he said. "After today, you deserve some fresh air that doesn't smell like smoke." They walked through the town as the sun set, painting everything gold. People nodded to them as they passed. Not exactly friendly, but no longer hostile. The fire had changed something in the town's perception of Margaret. "You did good today," Thomas said as they reached the edge of town where the forest began. "Showed them you're not just some delicate eastern flower." "I never was," Margaret replied. "Even in Boston, I worked for my living. Being tall doesn't make me fragile. If anything, it's made me stronger. I've had to be." Thomas stopped walking, turning to face her. In the fading light, his blue eyes were serious. "Margaret, I need to say something, and if it's too forward, just tell me to hush. But I've been thinking about it since the day you arrived, and after today." Margaret's heart began to race. "What is it?" "I know you came here to marry Edward Price. I know you're probably not looking for, well, for anything like that right now. But I want you to know that I admire you, not just for standing up to Price, but for staying when it would have been easier to leave. For working hard and not complaining. For being exactly who you are without apology." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "What I'm trying to say is, if you ever do decide you're ready to consider, that is, if you wanted to walk out with me proper-like, I'd be honored." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Here was a man who saw her height not as a flaw to be overlooked, but as part of who she was. A man who valued her strength rather than being threatened by it. "Thomas?" she began, then stopped, unsure how to express what she was feeling. "I came here with one set of expectations, and everything's changed so fast. I don't know if I'm ready for—" "I'm not asking for anything now," Thomas said quickly. "Just wanted you to know where I stand. You take all the time you need to figure out where you stand. I'll still be here, still be your friend, regardless." They continued their walk in comfortable silence, the forest peaceful around them. As they turned back toward town, Margaret felt something settle in her chest. She'd lost the future she'd planned with Edward Price, but perhaps she'd found something better. A chance to build a life on her own terms, with people who valued her for who she really was. Sunday arrived with another dose of Oregon rain, but it didn't dampen the spirits of Silver Creek's residents preparing for the church social that evening. Margaret spent the morning helping Mrs. Henshaw prepare food for the event, trying to ignore the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "You're going, and that's final," Mrs. Henshaw said when Margaret expressed doubts for the 5th time. "You can't hide in this boarding house forever." "I'm not hiding. I'm being practical. Eleanor Patterson will be there, and Edward, and Thomas Hale, who specifically asked you to come, Mrs. Henshaw interrupted. "Besides, half the town saw you fighting that fire yesterday. You've earned your place at that social." That evening, Margaret stood before the small mirror in her room, adjusting her best dress, a deep blue silk she'd made herself in Boston. It was one of the few fine things she'd kept, and it fit her tall frame perfectly, emphasizing rather than hiding her height. She'd learned long ago that trying to disguise her stature only made it more noticeable. The church was already crowded when she arrived with Mrs. Henshaw and the other boarders. The moment she entered, conversation stuttered and stopped. Margaret forced herself to keep her head high, moving through the crowd as if she didn't notice the stares and whispers. The church had been cleared of pews for the evening, creating a dance floor. Tables along the sides groaned with food, and a small group of musicians was tuning their instruments in the corner. It was rustic compared to the society gathering she'd attended in Boston, but there was a warmth and genuineness to it that those formal affairs had lacked. "Miss Collins!" Reverend Dawson approached, a thin man with kind eyes who barely reached her elbow. "How wonderful that you've joined us. I heard about your efforts at the fire yesterday. Very commendable." Before Margaret could respond, Eleanor Patterson appeared, resplendent in yellow silk that probably cost more than most workers made in a month. "Reverend," Eleanor said sweetly, "surely there must be some mistake. This event is for members of our community, not for transients." "Miss Collins is a member of our community," the Reverend replied mildly. "She lives here, works here, and as of yesterday, has helped protect our town from disaster. That seems like membership to me." Eleanor's sweet expression soured. "Well, I certainly hope she doesn't expect anyone to dance with her. It would be quite the spectacle, a woman towering over her partner like some kind of maypole." The words were meant to wound, and they did. Margaret felt heat rise in her face, but before she could respond, a familiar voice spoke from behind her. "Actually, I was hoping Miss Collins would honor me with the first dance." Margaret turned to find Thomas, dressed in his Sunday best, his hair carefully combed but already starting to rebel against the pomade. He was tall enough that she could wear her good boots with their slight heel and still have to look up slightly to meet his eyes. "Mr. Hale," Eleanor said, her tone suddenly much sweeter, "surely you'd prefer a partner more proportionate?" "I prefer," Thomas said firmly, offering Margaret his arm, "a partner who doesn't judge others by their appearance. Shall we, Margaret?" The musicians struck up a waltz, and Thomas led her onto the floor. Margaret was aware of every eye in the room on them, but as Thomas's hand found her waist and they began to move, the scrutiny faded away. "You're a good dancer," she said, surprised. "My mother taught me," Thomas replied, leading her through a turn. "Said a man who couldn't dance was only half civilized. You're not too bad yourself." Years of lessons in Boston, though I rarely had partners tall enough to dance with properly. She paused, then added quietly, "This is nice, not having to shrink myself down." "You should never shrink yourself for anyone," Thomas said firmly. "Not ever." Other couples had joined them on the floor now, though Margaret noticed they gave them a wide berth, as if height might be contagious. She didn't care. For the first time in her life, she was dancing with a man who made her feel feminine and delicate despite her unusual stature. When the music ended, Thomas led her to the refreshment table, staying close as if to ward off any unpleasant comments. But something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. Seeing them together, seeing how well they matched, seemed to have given people a new perspective. "They make a handsome couple," Margaret heard one woman whisper, "both so tall and strong-looking." "Like something out of a fairy tale," another agreed. "Those old ones where the heroes were giants." Patrick appeared at Margaret's elbow, slightly drunk but cheerful. "Miss Margaret, you've got to help me win a bet. O'Malley says you couldn't possibly be strong enough to lift a flour sack, but I say a woman who can work a bucket line can handle anything." "Patrick, you're drunk," Thomas said warningly. "It's all right," Margaret said, amused despite herself. "What kind of flour sack?" 50 pounds. O'Malley says no woman could lift it over her head." A crowd was gathering, drawn by the prospect of a spectacle. Margaret knew she should decline, maintain her dignity, not make herself more of a curiosity. But then she caught sight of Eleanor Patterson's smirking face, so certain that Margaret would embarrass herself. "Bring the sack," Margaret said. The crowd parted as someone fetched a flour sack from the church's storage. It was hefty, 50 pounds of dead weight. Margaret had lifted heavier things in Boston, helping her landlady with deliveries when the woman's back was bad. She positioned herself carefully, bent her knees, grasped the sack properly, and in one smooth motion lifted it over her head. The crowd gasped, then erupted in cheers and applause. She held it there for a count of 3, then lowered it carefully back down. "Pay up, O'Malley," Patrick crowed. "I told you she was strong as an ox." "Stronger than some oxen I've known," O'Malley admitted, digging in his pocket for coins. Edward Price pushed through the crowd, his face thunderous. "This is disgraceful. A woman making a spectacle of herself, acting like some kind of circus strongman." "Circus strongwoman," Margaret corrected calmly, "and I prefer to think of it as demonstrating capability." "Capability?" Edward sputtered. "You're making a mockery of womanhood." "No," Margaret said, her voice carrying across the now silent room. "I'm showing that womanhood comes in more than one form. I may be tall and strong, Mr. Price, but I'm still a woman. I still sew and cook and tend to others. I still feel and care and love. My height doesn't diminish any of that. It's simply part of who I am." "Well said!" Reverend Dawson stepped forward. "If I may, this seems like a perfect opportunity to remind everyone of 1 Samuel, chapter 16. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Miss Collins has shown her heart through her actions, her hard work, her help during the fire, her grace in the face of unkindness. That matters far more than her height." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. Even some who had mocked Margaret initially seemed thoughtful now. Eleanor Patterson wasn't finished, though. "Pretty words, Reverend, but the fact remains that Miss Collins came here under false pretenses. She deceived my brother." "I describe myself accurately in every particular except height," Margaret interrupted. "Your brother never asked about it, and it never occurred to me that it would matter so much. If anyone was deceived, it was I. His letter spoke of wanting a partner, a helpmate, someone to build a life with. Instead, I found a man who cared more about appearances than character." "How dare you?" "Oh, shut up, Eleanor," Mrs. Henshaw said bluntly, causing several people to gasp. "Your brother's a fool who lost out on a fine woman because he couldn't see past his own pride. And you're no better strutting around here like you own the place because you married well. At least Miss Collins earns her own way." The musicians, sensing the tension, struck up another tune. Thomas immediately offered Margaret his hand again. "Dance with me," he said. "Let them gossip if they want. We'll be too busy enjoying ourselves to care." They danced 3 more times that evening, and by the 3rd dance, other men had found the courage to ask Margaret to partner them as well. She danced with Patrick, who was surprisingly graceful despite his inebriation, and with the Reverend, who had to stand on his toes but managed admirably, and even with old Mr. Jameson from the Mercantile, who told her she reminded him of his late wife, a woman of substance in every way. As the evening wore on, Margaret noticed a shift in how people treated her. The fire had earned their respect, but tonight had earned something more: acceptance. She wasn't just the tall woman Edward Price had rejected anymore. She was becoming Margaret Collins, seamstress, neighbor, part of the community. Near the end of the evening, as Margaret was helping clear tables, she overheard 2 women talking. "I still say she's unnaturally tall," one said. "Maybe," the other replied. "But did you see how she looked at Thomas Hale? And how he looked at her? That's not unnatural. That's love starting to bloom, mark my words." Margaret felt her cheeks warm and quickly moved away, but the words stayed with her. Was that what this feeling was? This warmth in her chest when Thomas smiled at her? This sense of rightness when they stood together? As the social ended and people began to leave, Thomas walked Margaret back to the boarding house. The rain had stopped, and stars were visible between the clouds. "Thank you," Margaret said as they reached the porch. "For dancing with me, for standing by me, for everything." "You don't need to thank me for doing what I wanted to do," Thomas replied. "Margaret, I meant what I said yesterday. I'm not pushing, but I want you to know you're the most remarkable woman I've ever met. Not because of your height, but because of your courage, your strength, your kindness, even to those who don't deserve it." Margaret looked up at this giant of a man who made her feel precious and protected, who saw her as remarkable rather than abnormal. "Thomas, The boarding house door burst open, and Patrick stumbled out. "Miss Margaret!" "Thomas, come quick! There's been an accident at the mill. They're bringing in wounded." The moment shattered, but duty called. Margaret grabbed her sewing kit, wounds would need stitching, and followed Thomas and Patrick into the night. As they ran toward the doctor's house where the injured were being taken, Margaret realized that somewhere between her arrival on that platform and this moment, Silver Creek had become her home. She had work, friends, a place in the community, and possibly, her eyes found Thomas's broad back ahead of her, something more. Edward Price had rejected her for her height, calling her an aberration, a mistake. But his rejection had led her to this, to a life where she could stand tall, literally and figuratively, where her strength was valued rather than scorned. She'd come to Oregon to become someone's wife, to fit into a predetermined role. Instead, she was becoming herself, fully and unapologetically. The doctor's house was already crowded when they arrived, wounded men lying on every available surface. Margaret immediately set to work, her steady hands and strong stomach serving her well as she helped clean and stitch wounds alongside the doctor's wife. Thomas worked with the doctor, his strength needed to hold down men in pain while bones were set and deeper wounds were treated. It was nearly dawn before the last man was tended to. Margaret's dress was ruined with blood and her hands ached from hours of detailed work, but she felt a deep satisfaction. She'd been useful, needed, valued for her skills rather than judged for her appearance. As she and Thomas walked back to the boarding house in the gray pre-dawn light, both exhausted, he suddenly stopped. "Margaret," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "I know the timing's all wrong, but seeing you tonight at the social, then helping those men, I just need you to know something." "What is it?" "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "I know it's too soon. I know you came here for another man, but I can't help it. You're extraordinary, and not just because we match in height. You're brave and kind and strong in all the ways that matter. I just wanted you to know in case you might feel something similar someday." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. She thought of Edward Price's cruel rejection, of the journey that had brought her here, of all the reasons she should be cautious. Then she looked at Thomas, exhausted, blood on his shirt, his heart in his eyes, and made her choice. "I don't need someday," she said softly. "I feel it now. It terrifies me. It's not what I planned, but I'm falling in love with you too, Thomas Hale." His face transformed with joy, and he reached for her hands, holding them gently despite their difference in strength. "Then we'll figure it out together. All of it. Edward Price, the town, everything, together." "Together," Margaret agreed, and as the sun began to rise over Silver Creek, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, she felt something she hadn't felt since stepping off that train. Hope. Not for the future she'd planned, but for one that might be infinitely better. The weeks following that confession at dawn transformed Silver Creek in ways Margaret couldn't have anticipated. News of her budding romance with Thomas Hale spread through town like wildfire, creating ripples that reached every corner of the community. Some viewed it as a romantic tale worthy of the dime novels sold at the Mercantile. Two tall souls finding each other against all odds. Others, particularly those in Edward Price's circle, saw it as a deliberate insult, a slap in the face to the established order of things. Margaret's sewing business flourished despite Edward's continued attempts at sabotage. Her sunroom became a gathering place of sorts, where loggers and mill workers not only dropped off their mending, but lingered to share news from the camps, gossip from town, and occasionally seek advice on matters of the heart. She'd become, unexpectedly, a confidant to these rough men who found her easier to talk to than their peers. "Miss Margaret," Patrick said one afternoon, hovering in the doorway with unusual hesitation, "might I ask you something personal?" Margaret looked up from the coat she was patching, noting the young man's discomfort. "Of course, Patrick. What is it?" "There's a girl, works at the bakery. Sweet little thing, came from Ireland, same as me. But every time I try to talk to her, my tongue ties itself in knots. How does a man court a woman proper-like?" Margaret set down her needle, touched by his trust. "Well, first you might start by not referring to her as a sweet little thing. Women appreciate being seen as people, not possessions or children." Patrick's face reddened. "I didn't mean—" "I know you didn't," Margaret said gently. But words matter. What's her name? Bridget O'Connell. She's got eyes green as the hills back home and a laugh like church bells. Now that's better. Have you spoken to her at all? Only to order bread. But last week she smiled at me special-like, or at least I think she did. Margaret hid her smile. Perhaps you could start by asking her about Ireland. Share memories of home. Common ground is always a good beginning. As Patrick left with his mended shirt and new courage, Margaret reflected on how strange life had become. 6 months ago, she'd been a struggling seamstress in Boston, dismissed by society for her height and reduced circumstances. Now she was dispensing courtship advice to Irish loggers and finding her own unexpected romance with a man who made her feel delicate despite her unusual stature. Thomas had been true to his word about taking things slowly, though the whole town seemed to be watching their courtship with keen interest. He came by every evening after work, ostensibly to deliver mending from the camps, but really to spend an hour in Margaret's company while she sewed. They talked about everything, his dreams of owning his own lumber operation, her memories of Boston before her family's fortune failed, books they'd read, places they hoped to see. I've been thinking, Thomas said one evening as October gave way to November, the rain drumming steadily on the windows. There's a piece of land for sale about 10 miles north. Good timber, water access, far enough from Price's operations that he couldn't interfere. I've saved almost enough. Margaret's needle paused. You're really going to do it? Start your own company? Been planning it for 5 years, but lately... He paused, his blue eyes serious as they met hers. Lately, I've been thinking about building something more than just a business. A home, a family. A life with someone who shares my dreams. The weight of his unspoken question hung in the air between them. Margaret knew what he was really asking, whether she could see herself as part of that future, whether she was ready to risk her heart again after Edward's cruel rejection. Before she could respond, the door burst open, bringing with it a gust of cold wind and Eleanor Patterson, her face twisted with fury beneath her expensive hat. You! She pointed at Margaret with a trembling finger. You've ruined everything. Mrs. Henshaw appeared from the kitchen, dish towel in hand. Mrs. Patterson, you can't just barge in here. My husband has left me, Eleanor shrieked, and the words seemed to shock even her. He's taken up with some saloon girl, says I'm too cold, too concerned with appearances. And it's your fault. Margaret stood slowly, setting aside her sewing. Mrs. Patterson, I'm sorry for your troubles, but I don't see how... Don't you? Eleanor laughed bitterly. You came here, flaunting your height, refusing to be ashamed, taking up with Thomas Hale like you had a right to happiness. You've given every misfit and oddity in this town ideas above their station. My own husband said... She choked on the words. He said he was tired of pretending, tired of living up to the Patterson Price standards. He said you were right that day at the church, about there being more than one way to be a woman. Well, apparently he thinks there's more than one way to be a husband too, and that way involves humiliating me. Despite everything Eleanor had done to her, Margaret felt a pang of sympathy. She knew what it was like to be publicly rejected, to have your expectations shattered. I'm truly sorry, Margaret said quietly. No one deserves that kind of betrayal. Eleanor's anger seemed to deflate, replaced by something rawer. I did everything right. I was the perfect height, the perfect size, the perfect wife. I hosted dinners, supported his business, never complained. And for what? To be left for a woman who serves drinks to loggers? Maybe, Thomas said gently, the problem wasn't that you weren't perfect. Maybe it was that you were so busy being perfect you forgot to be real. Eleanor turned on him. What would you know about it? You're just a logger who knows what it's like to pretend to be something you're not, Thomas finished. I spent years trying to be smaller, quieter, less than I was because I thought it would make others more comfortable. It wasn't until I met Margaret, who refuses to shrink herself for anyone's comfort, that I realized what I was doing. Eleanor stared at them, Thomas towering and solid, Margaret tall and unbowed beside him, and something in her expression cracked. It's not fair. You broke the rules and found happiness. I followed them and lost everything. The rules were wrong, Margaret said simply. They were always wrong. Forcing people into boxes based on height or appearance or station, it makes everyone miserable in the end. Eleanor sank into a chair, suddenly looking far older than her 30 years. What am I supposed to do now? I can't stay in Silver Creek. The scandal. Edward is furious, says I've brought shame on the family name. You could start over, Margaret suggested. Go somewhere new, be someone different. Not perfect, just yourself. Myself? Eleanor laughed hollowly. I don't even know who that is anymore. It was a strange moment sitting in Mrs. Henshaw's parlor with the woman who'd tried to drive her from town, offering comfort for a pain Margaret understood all too well. But she'd learned something in her months in Silver Creek. Holding on to anger was like gripping a hot coal. It burned you more than anyone else. After Eleanor left, subdued and somehow smaller despite her perfectly proportioned frame, Thomas turned to Margaret. That was kind of you, after everything she's done. Kindness costs nothing, Margaret replied, though she was shaken by the encounter. And I know what it's like to have your world turned upside down by a man's rejection. You're nothing like her, Thomas said firmly. When Edward rejected you, you didn't collapse. You built something new, something better. I had help, Margaret reminded him, her eyes soft as she looked at him. I had you and Mrs. Henshaw and this whole unlikely community. Eleanor has no one now. The next day brought unexpected consequences from Eleanor's visit. Her husband's abandonment and her public breakdown at the boarding house had shifted something in the town's social dynamics. If Eleanor Patterson, the epitome of feminine perfection, could be left for a saloon girl, then perhaps the standards everyone had been trying to meet were meaningless after all. Margaret noticed it first at the Mercantile, where Mrs. Fisher, the banker's wife, actually smiled at her instead of looking through her as she'd done for months. Miss Collins, she said hesitantly, I wonder if I might commission some work from you. Not mending, but actual dressmaking. I've seen what you wear. You made those yourself, didn't you? They're quite striking. Margaret was stunned. Mrs. Fisher, I thought Mrs. Patterson, that is, Eleanor, handled all the ladies' clothing needs. Eleanor is leaving town, Mrs. Fisher said quietly. And frankly, many of us are tired of being told what's appropriate to wear based on her narrow ideas of fashion. You dress for your height, emphasize it rather than hiding it. I'd like something that emphasizes who I am too, rather than hiding it. And what would you like emphasized? Mrs. Fisher smiled, and it transformed her plain face. I'm nearly 40, Miss Collins. I've had 3 children. I run my household and half my husband's business, though he'd never admit it. I want to look like a woman of substance and capability, not like I'm trying to pretend I'm still 18 and delicate. It was the beginning of an unexpected shift in Margaret's business. Over the following weeks, more women approached her, not for mending, but for custom clothing that fit their actual bodies and lives rather than some impossible ideal. The minister's wife wanted something that wouldn't restrict her movement when she helped with church work. The school teacher wanted dresses that could withstand the chaos of a classroom full of children. Even some of the younger women, tired of Eleanor's rigid rules about propriety, wanted clothing that let them be more active, more themselves. Margaret's sunroom became even busier, and she had to expand into the adjacent parlor. Mrs. Henshaw didn't mind. The boarding house was thriving with all the additional traffic, and she'd started serving tea and cakes to waiting customers, creating an informal social space where women who'd never spoken before found themselves sharing conversations. Edward Price, predictably, was furious about his sister's scandal and the shift in the town's social order. He appeared at the boarding house on a gray Thursday afternoon when Margaret was fitting Mrs. Fisher for her new dress. "You've destroyed my family," he said without preamble, ignoring Mrs. Fisher's presence entirely. "First you humiliate me, then you turn the town against proper standards, and now my sister's marriage has collapsed." Margaret continued pinning the hem, not bothering to look up. "Your sister's marriage collapsed because her husband was unhappy. That has nothing to do with me." "It has everything to do with you. Before you came, everyone knew their place. Everyone understood how things were supposed to be." "Before I came," Margaret said, finally standing to face him, "everyone was pretending. Your sister pretended to be perfect. Her husband pretended to be satisfied. and you pretended that making people feel small made you bigger. Mrs. Fisher surprised everyone by speaking up. She's right, Edward. We've all been miserable trying to meet impossible standards. At least now we're honestly seeking happiness instead of dishonestly maintaining appearances. Edward's face went purple. You'll regret this, all of you. When this town falls apart without proper order, when your businesses fail without my support, your support. Thomas's voice came from the doorway. He must have heard the commotion from outside where he'd been chopping wood for Mrs. Henshaw. Price, you don't support this town. You leech from it. You pay the lowest wages, charge the highest prices at your company store, and treat everyone like they should be grateful for the privilege of making you rich. I provide jobs. You provide exploitation, Thomas countered. But that's about to change. I've bought the Northridge tract. Come spring, I'll be starting my own operation. Fair wages, fair prices, and any man who wants to work for dignity instead of scraps is welcome to join me. The room went silent. This was a direct challenge to Edward's economic dominance, and everyone knew it. Edward's eyes narrowed. You don't have the capital to start a logging operation. I have enough, and I have something more important, the respect of the men. How many of your workers do you think will stay when they have another option? You're making a mistake, Hale. I'll crush your little operation before it even starts. You can try, Thomas said calmly, but you might want to focus on keeping your own business afloat. Word is, Jacobson's considering expanding his mill. Between him and me, your monopoly is about to become a memory. Edward stormed out, but not before throwing one last venomous look at Margaret. This isn't over. After he left, Mrs. Fisher let out a breath she'd been holding. My goodness, that was frightening and thrilling all at once. Thomas, are you really starting your own company? I am, Thomas confirmed, his eyes finding Margaret's. Been planning it for years, but recent events have convinced me it's time to build something new, something better. Margaret felt her heart swell with pride and something deeper. This man, her gentle giant, was risking everything to create change, to challenge the established order that had tried to crush both of them. That evening, as November rain pelted the windows and the boarding house settled into quiet, Thomas and Margaret sat together in the sunroom, now empty of customers. She was working on an elaborate dress for the mayor's wife while he sketched plans for his lumber operation. You know Edward will do everything he can to stop you, Margaret said, her needle moving in precise stitches. I know, but I'm tired of men like him deciding how things should be. He rejected you because you didn't fit his narrow idea of what a wife should look like. He's run this town the same way, rejecting anything that doesn't fit his narrow idea of how things should be. Margaret set down her sewing and moved to sit beside him, studying his sketches. These are ambitious plans. I'm an ambitious man, Thomas said, then added more softly, ambitious enough to think I might win the heart of the most remarkable woman in Oregon. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Thomas, I know we said we'd take things slow, but Margaret, I need you to know, my plans for the future, they all include you. Not as some prize or possession, but as a partner, someone to build something real with. Margaret's breath caught. This was so different from Edward's business-like proposal by mail, from the other offers she'd received from men who saw her height as either a curiosity or a challenge. Thomas saw her as an equal, a partner, someone whose dreams were as important as his own. I've been thinking too, she admitted. When I came here, I thought I wanted security, respectability, a predetermined role to fill. But these months in Silver Creek have shown me I want something more. I want to build something, create something, be part of changing things for the better. Then be part of it with me, Thomas said, taking her hands in his massive ones. Not just the business, but all of it. Marry me, Margaret, not because I need a wife to complete my image or run my household, but because I can't imagine facing the future without you beside me. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Thomas, are you sure? The whole town will talk. Edward will make our lives difficult. Your business could suffer. Let them talk. Let Edward rage. None of it matters if I don't have you. He cupped her face gently in his hands. You taught me to stand tall and be damned to anyone who doesn't like it. Now I'm asking you to stand tall with me for the rest of our lives. Yes, Margaret whispered, then stronger. "Yes, Thomas Hale, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, and Margaret felt something slot into place in her chest. This was what she'd traveled 3,000 miles to find. Not Edward Price's cold arrangement, but this warm, real, powerful love with a man who saw her strength as beautiful. News of their engagement spread through Silver Creek like wildfire. By morning, everyone knew that Thomas Hale and Margaret Collins were to be married. Reactions were mixed, but mostly positive. The working men cheered the news, seeing it as another victory against Edward Price's tyranny. The women who'd become Margaret's customers were delighted, already planning what they'd wear to the wedding. Even Reverend Dawson stopped by to offer his congratulations and his services for the ceremony. But Edward Price's reaction was swift and vicious. He immediately banned any of his employees from patronizing Margaret's sewing business and threatened to fire anyone who attended the wedding. He spread rumors that Margaret had somehow bewitched Thomas, that she was a gold digger after his savings, that the marriage was a sham designed to humiliate the Price family further. The pressure might have worked 6 months ago, when Margaret was alone and friendless in Silver Creek. But now she had allies, a community that had grown to respect and even admire her. When Edward threatened to stop extending credit at his company's store to anyone who associated with Margaret, the German butcher extended credit of his own. When he tried to prevent the church from hosting the wedding, Reverend Dawson reminded him that the church belonged to God, not the Price family. The wedding was set for Christmas Eve, giving them 6 weeks to prepare. Margaret threw herself into the work, not just preparing for the wedding, but expanding her business to meet increasing demand. She hired 2 young women who'd been working at the match factory, dangerous, poorly paid work, and taught them her trade. Her sunroom operation became a proper workshop, with 3 sewing machines Mrs. Henshaw had purchased as an investment. "You're building something important here," Mrs. Henshaw said one evening, watching Margaret teach her assistants a particularly difficult technique. Not just a business, but a different way of doing things. These girls would have had no options before except factory work or marriage. Now they have a trade, independence. Margaret looked at her 2 assistants, Mary, barely 18 and shy as a mouse, and Catherine, a widow with 2 small children, and felt a surge of pride. She'd come to Silver Creek expecting to become someone's wife, nothing more. Now she was becoming a businesswoman, a teacher, a force for change in her own right. Thomas was equally busy preparing for their future. He'd secured loans from investors outside of Silver Creek, men who had no loyalty to Edward Price and saw the potential in Thomas's operation. He'd already hired 15 men away from Price's mill with the promise of better wages and working conditions. The foundation for their home was being laid on a hill overlooking the valley, with views of the mountains that took Margaret's breath away. "It'll be small to start," Thomas said, showing her the plans, "but we can add on as our family grows." Our family. The words sent a thrill through Margaret. Children who might inherit their height, who would grow up in a world where being different wasn't something to be ashamed of. 2 weeks before the wedding, an unexpected visitor arrived at the boarding house. Margaret was fitting Mrs. Fisher for her wedding outfit when Mrs. Henshaw announced, "Margaret, there's someone here to see you. Says she's come from Boston." Margaret's heart stopped. She emerged from the sunroom to find a small, elegantly dressed woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an expression of determined curiosity. "Aunt Charlotte!" Margaret gasped. Charlotte Winters, her mother's sister who had cut off contact when the family fortune was lost, stood in Mrs. Henshaw's parlor looking entirely out of place but surprisingly pleased. "Margaret, my dear girl, when I received word that you were to be married, I had to come see for myself." "But who told you?" Charlotte's lips quirked in a small smile. "You're Mr. Price, actually. He wrote to me, warning me that you'd fallen into a terrible situation, that you were marrying beneath yourself to spite him. He thought I might intervene." Margaret's stomach churned. "Aunt Charlotte, I can explain. No need. I've spent the last day in this town, Margaret. I've spoken to people, observed your work, met your Mr. Hale. Edward Price is a pompous fool who couldn't see treasure when it was standing right in front of him." Margaret sank into a chair, overwhelmed. "You're not here to stop the wedding?" "Stop it? My dear, I'm here to apologize. When your father lost his fortune, I was cruel. I cut you off when you needed family most. I let pride and fear of social embarrassment guide my actions. But hearing about you here, standing tall despite everything, building a business, finding love, you've done what I never had the courage to do. You've chosen happiness over propriety. Charlotte opened her purse and withdrew an envelope. This is your inheritance from your grandmother. I've been holding it, telling myself I was waiting for you to marry respectably. But respectability is a cage, Margaret. You've already freed yourself. This is just to help you fly higher. The check inside was enough to fully fund Thomas's lumber operation and expand Margaret's workshop into a proper factory. Margaret stared at it, then at her aunt, tears streaming down her face. I don't know what to say. Say you'll let me stay for your wedding. Let me stand as your family, the way I should have stood by you years ago. The reconciliation with Aunt Charlotte added another layer to the wedding preparations. She took a room at the boarding house and threw herself into helping, using her Boston connections to order fabric and supplies that would have taken months to obtain otherwise. She also proved to be a formidable ally against Edward Price's continued harassment. That little man actually had the audacity to suggest I take you back to Boston, Charlotte said one evening, laughing, as if you were some wayward child to be collected. I told him that Margaret had found something in Silver Creek that all his money couldn't buy, genuine love and honest respect. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, with snow dusting the mountains and frost sparkling on every surface. The church was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in the aisles and crowding the doorway. It seemed the entire town had defied Edward Price's threats to witness the union of their tall couple. Margaret stood in the small room off the sanctuary, wearing a dress she'd made herself, ivory silk that emphasized her height rather than hiding it, with intricate embroidery she'd worked by candlelight for weeks. Aunt Charlotte and Mrs. Henshaw fussed around her, adjusting her veil, smoothing her skirt. You look magnificent, Aunt Charlotte said, tears in her eyes, like a Norse goddess about to conquer the world. I'm just Margaret, she replied, though her heart was racing. Just a tall woman from Boston who sews for a living. No, Mrs. Henshaw said firmly. You're a woman who stood up to the most powerful man in town, who built a business from nothing, who changed how this entire community thinks about what's possible. You're anything but just anything. The organ began to play, and Margaret made her way to the sanctuary entrance. Through the doors, she could see Thomas waiting at the altar, resplendent in a new suit that actually fit his giant frame properly. His face when he saw her, the pure joy and love radiating from his expression, made every hardship, every cruel word, every moment of doubt worth it. She walked down the aisle alone, having chosen to give herself away rather than rely on any man's permission. The crowd murmured appreciatively. She looked like a queen, tall and regal, owning every inch of her impressive height. Patrick, serving as Thomas's best man despite a spectacular black eye from a recent fight defending Margaret's honor, was openly crying. You clean up nice, Miss Margaret, he whispered loudly, making several people chuckle. Reverend Dawson, standing on a small platform so he could be seen over the tall couple, began the ceremony with unusual words. Dearly beloved, we gather today to witness something remarkable, not just a wedding, but a triumph of love over prejudice, of courage over convention, of two people choosing to stand tall together despite those who would rather see them diminish themselves. Margaret barely heard the traditional words that followed. She was lost in Thomas's blue eyes, in the feeling of his massive hands holding hers, in the rightness of this moment. When it came time for the vows, Thomas surprised her by speaking his own. Margaret Collins, you came to this town expecting one future and found another. You could have left, could have retreated, but instead you stood tall and taught us all to do the same. You've made me brave enough to be fully myself, to reach for dreams I'd almost given up on. I promise to stand beside you, to support your dreams as fiercely as you've supported mine, and to love you not despite your magnificent height, but because of everything it represents, your strength, your courage, your refusal to be anything less than exactly who you are. Margaret's voice was thick with tears as she responded. Thomas Hale, you saw me when others saw only an oddity. You offered friendship when I had nothing, protection when I was vulnerable, and love when I'd stopped believing I deserved it. You make me feel precious and powerful at the same time. I promise to stand with you as we build our future, to be your partner in all things, and to love you for exactly who you are. My gentle giant, my protector, my best friend, my love. When Reverend Dawson pronounced them husband and wife and Thomas kissed her, the church erupted in cheers so loud they likely heard them in the next county. As they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Hale, Margaret saw something she'd never expected. Edward Price, standing in the very back of the church, his face unreadable. Their eyes met across the crowded sanctuary. For a moment she thought he might cause a scene, might try one last time to destroy her happiness. But then, inexplicably, he nodded, just once, barely perceptible, and slipped out the door. It wasn't forgiveness or friendship, but perhaps it was acceptance that his world had changed, and there was nothing he could do to change it back. The reception was held at the boarding house, which had been transformed with evergreen boughs and candles into something magical. The entire town seemed to squeeze inside, sharing food and drink and stories. Margaret noticed something wonderful. The artificial barriers that had divided the town were breaking down. Mrs. Fisher was deep in conversation with the German butcher's wife, sharing recipes. The schoolteacher was dancing with one of the loggers, both laughing at their clumsy attempts at a waltz. Even some of Edward Price's employees had defied his orders to attend, welcomed warmly by Thomas's crew. "Look what you've done," Thomas murmured in her ear as they watched the celebration. "You've changed this whole town just by being yourself." "We've changed it," Margaret corrected. "Together." As the evening wore on, various people stood to make toasts. Patrick, well into his cups, gave a rambling speech about friendship and loyalty that somehow ended with him proposing to Bridget O'Connell right there in front of everyone. She said yes, causing another round of cheers. Aunt Charlotte stood, commanding attention with the natural authority of a Boston matriarch. When I arrived in Silver Creek, I expected to find my niece diminished by her circumstances. Instead, I found her elevated. Margaret, you and Thomas represent something important: the courage to reject narrow definitions of acceptability and create your own path. May your marriage be as tall and strong as you both are. Mrs. Henshaw was last, and her words were simple but powerful. 6 months ago, a scared young woman stood on my doorstep, abandoned and alone. Today, a confident woman stands before us, loved and respected, having built a life through her own efforts and courage. Margaret Thomas, you've shown us all that happiness comes not from fitting into the boxes others create for us, but from standing tall enough to see beyond them. As midnight approached and the celebration wound down, Thomas and Margaret slipped away to the small cabin he'd built as temporary lodging while their house was being finished. It sat on their land, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to celebrate their height rather than mock it. "No regrets?" Thomas asked as they stood on the porch, looking out over the moonlit valley that would be their empire. Margaret thought of the train platform 6 months ago, of Edward Price's cruel rejection, of the journey that had brought her here. "How could I regret the path that led me to you? Edward Price thought he was casting me aside like damaged goods. Instead, he set me free to find something real." "To find everything," Thomas corrected, pulling her close. As the last of 1887 gave way to the new year, Margaret stood in the arms of her giant husband, no longer the rejected mail-order bride, but Margaret Hale, businesswoman, wife, and living proof that sometimes the best things come from the worst disappointments. She'd traveled 3,000 miles to marry a stranger, only to discover that the stranger she needed to meet was herself. Tall, strong, and unapologetically taking up exactly as much space as she deserved. The first months of 1888 brought challenges that tested the newlyweds' resolve in ways neither had anticipated. Thomas's lumber operation faced sabotage at every turn. Equipment mysteriously broken, supplies delayed or lost, and potential contracts suddenly withdrawn when buyers received visits from Edward Price's representatives. Yet for every obstacle Price threw in their path, the community seemed to rally harder around the Hales. Margaret woke one February morning to find Thomas already dressed, staring out the window of their temporary cabin at something in the valley below. The tension in his shoulders told her everything she needed to know before she even looked. "What has he done now?" she asked, wrapping a shawl around her nightgown and joining him at the window. "The river," Thomas said quietly. "He's dammed it upstream. Our mill needs that water flow to operate the saws." Margaret could see it now. Where the river should have been running strong with winter snowmelt, it was reduced to a trickle. Without water power, Thomas's newly built sawmill was useless, and they both knew Edward Price owned the land upstream. "Can he do that legally?" Margaret asked, though she suspected the answer. "Legal doesn't matter much when you own the judge," Thomas replied, his jaw clenched. "He's trying to force me out before I can even properly begin." Margaret felt rage rise in her chest. Not the hot, impulsive anger of youth, but something colder and more determined. "Then we'll find another way. We didn't come this far to be stopped by a man who thinks he owns the water itself." Thomas turned to her, and despite their dire circumstances, his lips quirked in a small smile. "Listen to you, my warrior wife. What do you propose we do? March up there and tear down his dam with our bare hands?" "If necessary," Margaret said, only half joking. "But I think there might be a better way. Get dressed for town. We're going to pay some visits." Within an hour, they were at Jacobson's office. The older lumber baron listened to their predicament with a frown deepening the lines around his eyes. "Price is getting desperate," Jacobson said finally. "Your operation threatens his monopoly, and my expansion threatens his mill. He's like a wounded animal, lashing out at everything." "We need that water, Mr. Jacobson," Thomas said. "Without it, we can't fulfill the contracts we've already signed." "We'll be ruined before we properly begin." Jacobson leaned back in his chair, studying them both. "There's another water source. Spring Creek runs through my land and the public lands before it reaches yours. Smaller than the main river, but with some engineering, it could power your mill." "You'd let us divert water from your land?" Margaret asked, surprised. "I'd do more than that," Jacobson said. "I'll fund the diversion project in exchange for a partnership. 30% of your operation for my investment and ongoing support. Together, we can break Price's stranglehold on this region." Thomas and Margaret exchanged glances. Giving up 30% of their business was painful, but it was better than losing everything. "Deal," Thomas said, extending his hand. As they left Jacobson's office, Margaret noticed a crowd gathering near the general store. Patrick O'Brien was at the center of it, his red hair bright in the winter sun, gesturing animatedly as he spoke. "It's not right," he was saying. "Price thinks he owns everything, the trees, the land, now the water itself. How long before he decides he owns the air we breathe?" "What's the point of complaining?" someone called out. "He's got the money and the power." "He's got money," Patrick agreed, "but power? Real power comes from people standing together. Look at what Mrs. Hale accomplished. Price rejected her, tried to drive her out, and now she's got the most successful dressmaking business in 3 counties. Why? Because people supported her, chose to stand with her instead of bowing to Price's threats." Margaret felt Thomas's hand squeeze hers as they listened. Patrick had become an unofficial spokesman for the workers' growing discontent, his Irish gift for words serving him well in rallying support. "We could form a union," another voice suggested, one of Price's own mill workers. "Band together, demand fair wages and treatment." "And get fired for our trouble," someone else countered. "Not if we all stand together," Patrick insisted. "He can't fire everyone. Without workers, his mill is just expensive machinery gathering dust." The debate continued, but Margaret could see the seed had been planted. The town's deference to Edward Price was cracking, replaced by something more dangerous to his power than any business competition: solidarity among the workers. Over the next weeks, the diversion project proceeded with remarkable speed. Men from multiple camps volunteered their Sundays to help dig the new channel. Motivated by the promise of another option besides Price's operation and by genuine affection for Thomas, who had always treated workers with respect. Margaret, meanwhile, found her business flourishing beyond anything she'd imagined. With Aunt Charlotte's investment, she'd expanded into a proper workshop in town, employing 8 women now. They produced not just custom clothing, but ready-made garments that sold as far away as Portland. The label Collins Hale Designs was becoming known for quality and durability. She was examining a shipment of fabric one March afternoon when Mary, her youngest seamstress, burst through the door. "Mrs. Hale, come quick. There's been an accident at the Spring Creek site." Margaret's blood turned to ice. She grabbed her medical supplies, she'd become something of an auxiliary nurse through necessity, and ran toward the construction site, her long legs covering ground rapidly despite her skirts. She arrived to find chaos. The partial channel had collapsed and several men were injured, but it was the figure lying motionless beside the earthwork that made her heart stop. Thomas, his massive frame crumpled and still, blood seeping from a gash on his head. He was checking the support beams when it gave way, someone explained as Margaret dropped to her knees beside her husband. Pushed Murphy out of the way, but got caught himself. Margaret's hands were steady despite her terror as she examined him. The head wound was messy but not deep, though head wounds always bled dramatically. More concerning was his left leg, bent at an unnatural angle. "Get the doctor," she ordered, her voice carrying the authority that crisis brings. "Patrick, I need straight boards for a splint. Someone bring clean water and all the clean cloth you can find." For the next hour, Margaret worked with single-minded focus, cleaning and binding Thomas's head wound, carefully straightening and splinting his leg with Patrick's help, keeping him still and warm as they waited for the doctor. When Thomas finally stirred, groaning in pain, she nearly wept with relief. "Margaret?" His voice was rough, confused. "What happened?" "You decided to fight a wall of earth and lost," she said, trying for lightness despite the tears streaming down her face. "Your heroics saved Murphy but nearly killed you in the process." "Had to," Thomas mumbled. "Murphy's got 5 children. I've just got you." "Just me?" Margaret tried to sound offended. "Thomas Hale, you have me, and that's more than enough reason to be careful. You're not allowed to die on me, do you understand? We have an empire to build." The doctor arrived, confirming Margaret's field treatment had likely saved Thomas from worse injury. The leg was broken, but would heal clean if properly tended. The head injury, while dramatic, wasn't serious, but Thomas would be bedridden for at least 6 weeks. 6 weeks? Thomas tried to sit up, only to fall back with a groan. "We can't afford 6 weeks. The contracts will be handled," Margaret said firmly. "You're going to rest and heal, and I'm going to manage things." "Margaret, you can't." "Can't what?" "Can't run a business? I've been running my own successfully. Can't deal with lumber contracts? I've been listening to you talk about them for months. Can't handle Edward Price? I've been doing that since the day I arrived." The next morning, Margaret stood before the assembled workers at the mill site, all eyes on her. Some looked skeptical. A woman, even one as physically imposing as Margaret, directing a lumber operation was unheard of. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the yard, "Mr. Hale will recover, but it will take time. In his absence, I'll be overseeing operations. I know some of you have doubts about taking orders from a woman. You're free to leave if you can't stomach it. But know this, I'll work as hard as any of you. I'll ensure you're paid fairly and on time, and I'll fight anyone who tries to stop us from succeeding." "Even Price," someone called out. "Especially Price," Margaret replied, earning some chuckles. Patrick stepped forward. "I've worked for a lot of bosses. Most barely knew my name, let alone cared if I lived or died. Mrs. Hale stitched my shirt and listened to my troubles before she ever became the boss's wife. I'll follow her." One by one, the other men voiced their agreement. Margaret felt a swell of emotion she carefully controlled. These rough men, who could have laughed her out of the yard, were choosing to trust her. The first test came within days. A major contract with a Portland company was in jeopardy. They'd heard about Thomas's injury, and Edward Price had been whispering in their ear about the Hale operation's instability. Margaret traveled to Portland herself, wearing her best business attire and carrying detailed documentation of their capabilities. She walked into the ornate offices of Morrison Timber Company, feeling every stare but refusing to shrink. Mrs. Hale, Mr. Morrison, a portly man with impressive whiskers, looked her up and down with obvious surprise. "I expected, that is, we heard Mr. Hale was incapacitated." "Temporarily injured," Margaret corrected. "I'm managing operations in his absence." "Now, shall we discuss the terms of our contract?" "Madam, with all due respect, the lumber business is not needlework. It requires reliability, quality product, and timely delivery," Margaret interrupted. "All of which Hale Lumber provides. We have 40 men ready to work, equipment operational despite Mr. Price's attempts at sabotage, and a partnership with Jacobson that ensures stability. What we don't have is time for doubts based on my sex rather than our capabilities. Morrison's eyebrows rose. Price's sabotage. Margaret smiled grimly. Surely you've heard about his attempts to dam the river. A man who would deprive his competitors of water itself is not a stable business partner. How long before his desperation affects your supply? It was a calculated risk, speaking so boldly, but Margaret had learned that in business, as in life, confidence could overcome many obstacles. Morrison considered her words, then slowly nodded. "Show me your production schedules," he said. 2 hours later, Margaret left with not just the original contract secured, but an additional order for railroad ties. The triumph lasted until she returned to Silver Creek to find their temporary cabin surrounded by Price's men. "What's the meaning of this?" she demanded, pushing through them to find Edward himself inside, looming over Thomas, who was still bedridden. "Just explaining to Hale here that accidents happen," Edward said smoothly. "That collapse at Spring Creek, for instance. Terrible thing. Could happen again." Margaret moved between Price and her husband, drawing herself to her full height. "Are you threatening us?" "Merely observing that construction is dangerous work. Perhaps you should reconsider." "Get out!" Margaret's voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "Get out of my home before I show you just how dangerous I can be." Edward laughed. "You? What are you going to do, seamstress? Prick me with a needle?" Margaret picked up the iron poker from beside the fireplace, hefting it with ease. "I was thinking something more substantial. You seem to forget, Mr. Price, that I'm not some delicate flower. I'm nearly 6 feet tall. I've been working with my hands all my life, and right now I'm angry enough to test just how thick your skull really is." Price's men shifted nervously. They were used to intimidating people, not being threatened by a woman wielding a poker with obvious competence. "You wouldn't dare," Edward said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Wouldn't I? You've threatened my husband, my business, my life. You've tried to ruin us at every turn. And now you come into my home to threaten an injured man. Give me one reason why I shouldn't break your knees and claim self-defense. You'd hang for it. Maybe. Or maybe the judge would understand a woman protecting her invalid husband from intruders. Want to gamble which way it would go?" For a long moment they stared at each other. Then Edward stepped back. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Margaret agreed. "It's not. But the next time you threaten us, I won't give you the chance to walk away." After they left, Thomas looked at his wife with something approaching awe. "You actually would have hit him." "Broken his knees, more likely," Margaret said, setting the poker down with shaking hands. "Nobody threatens you while I'm alive, Thomas Hale." Nobody. The confrontation with Price marked a turning point. Word spread quickly about Margaret facing down Price and his men, and it seemed to inspire others. The nascent union movement Patrick had been advocating gained momentum. More of Price's workers defected to other operations. His control was slipping. Margaret threw herself into managing both businesses while caring for Thomas. She rose before dawn to review lumber contracts, spent mornings at the mill directing operations, afternoons at her workshop overseeing production, and evenings tending to Thomas and planning for the next day. "You're going to work yourself to death," Thomas warned one evening, watching her pore over ledgers by lamplight. "I'm doing what needs to be done," she replied, though exhaustion weighed on every word. "Come here," he said, patting the bed beside him. She set aside the ledgers and carefully sat beside him, mindful of his injuries. He took her hand in his massive one, thumb stroking over her calluses. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "Coming to Oregon, marrying me, taking on all this trouble?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "I regret that you're hurt. I regret that we have to fight so hard for what should be simple, but marrying you, building this life, never. Even though you're working yourself raw while I lie here useless?" "You're not useless. You're healing, and I'm not working any harder than you would in my place." She squeezed his hand. "We're partners, remember? In everything." April brought unexpected allies. A delegation of workers from Price's mill came to the cabin, hats in hand, led by an older man named Garrett, who'd worked for Price for 15 years. "Mrs. Hale, Mr. Hale," Garrett began nervously. "We've come to ask, that is, we're wondering if you'd have room for more workers." "You want to leave Price?" Thomas asked, struggling to sit up more fully. Want to? We need to. He's cut wages again, claiming losses from competition. Man's got a mansion and we can barely feed our families, but more than that. Garrett paused, choosing his words carefully. We've seen how you treat your workers. Fair wages, decent hours, respect. Mrs. Hale here faced down Price himself to protect you. When has Price ever protected any of us? Margaret exchanged glances with Thomas. Taking on Price's workers would be a declaration of war, but it would also provide the experienced hands they desperately needed. We can take 15 immediately, she said. More as contracts expand. But you understand Price won't take this lightly. Ma'am, with respect, we're past carrying what Price takes lightly, Garrett said. Man's pushed too far. Half his workforce is ready to walk. We just needed somewhere to walk to. The defection triggered exactly the response they'd expected. Price appeared at the mill the next day with the sheriff, claiming the workers had stolen company property, their work clothes of all things. Margaret stood her ground in front of the assembled workers. Sheriff Morrison, these men purchased those clothes from Price's company store at inflated prices. They owned them outright. Price says different, the sheriff said uncomfortably. He was clearly not pleased to be caught between the two factions. Then Price is lying, Margaret said flatly. Would you like to see the receipts? I'm sure the men kept them, knowing Price's tendency to claim ownership of everything down to the air they breathe. The sheriff shifted his weight. Now, Mrs. Hale, no need for hostility. No need. Sheriff, this man has dammed rivers, sabotaged equipment, threatened violence, and now he's trying to use you to intimidate workers who legally left his employment. At what point exactly should I become hostile? The crowd of workers behind her murmured agreement. The sheriff, faced with potentially volatile situation, made a practical choice. Unless you have proof of theft, Mr. Price, I can't arrest these men for wearing clothes. Price's face went purple. You're making a mistake, Morrison. When I'm through with the Hales, anyone who supported them will regret it. Is that a threat, Price? The sheriff's hand moved to his pistol. Because that sounded like a threat to me. Price backed down, but the damage was done. The sheriff's willingness to stand up to him, however minimally, emboldened others. By the time Thomas was able to walk with a crutch in May, their operation had doubled in size. The Spring Creek diversion was complete, providing adequate water power. Orders were coming in steadily, and Margaret's clothing business had expanded to supplying several stores in Portland. We're actually doing it, Thomas said one evening, standing on their porch overlooking the valley. The framework of their permanent home was rising on the hill above, and the sound of the mill carried on the evening breeze. We are, Margaret agreed, leaning against his solid warmth, though I could do with fewer death threats and acts of sabotage. As if in response to her words, a commotion arose from the direction of the mill. They could see flames beginning to lick at one of the storage sheds. Fire! Someone shouted. Margaret and Thomas rushed toward the mill, Thomas moving remarkably fast despite his still healing leg. By the time they arrived, the fire brigade was already forming. The town had gotten efficient at fighting fires, and this one was quickly controlled, but the damage was done. Thousands of board feet of finished lumber destroyed. Price, Thomas said grimly, though there was no proof. Maybe, Margaret said, studying the scene, but this feels different. Clumsy. Price is many things, but he's not clumsy. She was proven right the next morning when one of their own workers, a new hire named Collins, was caught with lamp oil on his clothes. Under questioning, he admitted Price had paid him to set the fire, but he'd gotten scared and done a poor job of it. Price must be desperate if he's resorting to hiring incompetent arsonists, Patrick observed, but Margaret saw it differently. No, he's testing us. Seeing how we respond, how the town responds. He's planning something bigger. Her instincts proved correct. A week later, Thomas was at the mill when a messenger arrived, breathless from running. Mr. Hale, you need to come quick. There's trouble at your wife's workshop. Thomas arrived to find a mob of rough-looking men surrounding the building. They weren't locals, hired thugs from the looks of them. Margaret stood in the doorway, her seamstresses huddled behind her, facing them down with remarkable composure. We're here to collect debts owed to Mr. Price, the lead thug was saying. I owe Edward Price nothing, Margaret replied coolly. He says different, Says you owe him for room and board when you first arrived, for damage to his reputation, for stealing his workers. And I say Edward Price can go to hell. The thug stepped forward menacingly. Lady, you don't want to make this difficult. Thomas pushed through the crowd, his massive frame causing the thugs to reassess their position. No, you don't want to make this difficult. Touch my wife or any of these women, and I'll take you apart piece by piece. You in what army? The thug sneered. This army, Patrick's voice came from behind. Thomas turned to see dozens of mill workers, dock workers, even shopkeepers, all armed with whatever they could find, axes, hammers, clubs. The entire working population of Silver Creek had mobilized. The thugs, outnumbered and facing an angry mob, made the wise choice to retreat. But as they left, their leader called out, "This isn't over. Price owns this town." "No," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly. "He used to own this town. Now it belongs to the people who actually live and work here." The crowd cheered, and in that moment, something fundamental shifted in Silver Creek. It was no longer Edward Price's town. It belonged to its citizens. That evening, an emergency town meeting was called. The church was packed, with people standing in the aisles and crowding outside the windows. Reverend Dawson tried to maintain order, but emotions were running high. "We can't keep living like this," Garrett said, speaking for many. "Price treating us like property, hiring thugs, burning buildings. When does it end?" "When we end it," Margaret said, standing to address the crowd. "Price has power because we've given it to him. We shop at his stores, bank at his bank, accept his wages and terms. What if we didn't?" "You're talking about a boycott," someone asked. "I'm talking about building our own economy," Margaret replied. "We have Jacobson's mill, Thomas's operation, my workshop. We could start our own stores, our own bank, our own futures. Price can't control what he doesn't own." "That's a pretty dream," a skeptical voice called out, "but it takes money to build those things." "Then we pool our resources," Thomas said, standing despite his still healing leg. "Form cooperatives. Share ownership and profits. Build something that belongs to all of us, not just one man." The idea was radical, dangerous even, but the town had been pushed too far, and radical ideas suddenly seemed possible. Aunt Charlotte, who'd extended her stay indefinitely, stood to speak. "In Boston, I've seen what happens when one man holds too much power. But I've also seen what happens when people band together. I'm willing to invest in this cooperative if the town is willing to work for it." One by one, others stood to pledge support. The German butcher offered to help establish a cooperative market. The school teacher suggested a community bank where profits would be shared among depositors. Even Mrs. Fisher, representing the more established families, offered support. Edward Price, of course, heard about the meeting within hours. His response was swift and vicious. He called in every debt, canceled every contract with businesses that had attended the meeting, and announced that any worker who participated in the cooperative would be blacklisted from his operations forever. But he'd miscalculated. The town's fear of him had transformed into anger, and anger into determination. Within a week, the Silver Creek Cooperative was officially formed, with Margaret and Thomas as founding members of the board. The battle for Silver Creek's soul intensified through the summer. Price used every tool at his disposal: legal challenges, economic pressure, even more hired thugs. But for every attack, the community grew stronger in its resistance. Margaret's workshop became a symbol of that resistance. She employed women who Price had tried to force into destitution, taught them trades, paid them fairly. Her designs, practical and beautiful, became a source of pride for the town. Women wore Collins Hale dresses as a statement of independence. Thomas's mill, despite the challenges, began to thrive. The quality of their lumber, combined with fair pricing and reliable delivery, attracted customers from throughout the region. The partnership with Jacobson provided stability, and the cooperative model meant workers shared in the profits they helped create. One August evening, as Margaret and Thomas sat on the porch of their nearly complete house, watching the sun set over their valley, she reflected on how much had changed since that awful day on the train platform. "I wonder sometimes," she said, "what would have happened if Edward had accepted me, if I'd married him as planned." Thomas's arm tightened around her. "You'd have been miserable. He'd have tried to make you smaller, to force you into his narrow idea of what a wife should be. And I might have let him. Margaret admitted. I was so desperate for belonging, for acceptance. I might have shrunk myself down to fit his expectations. Never, Thomas said firmly. You might have tried, but that spirit of yours, that strength, it would have burst free eventually. You're not made to be caged, Margaret Hale. She turned to look at her husband, this giant of a man who saw her height as beautiful, her strength as admirable, her ambitions as worthy. Neither are you. No, he agreed, but I might never have realized it without you. You taught me to stand tall, remember? A shout from below interrupted their quiet moment. Patrick was running up the hill, his red hair wild, his face urgent. Thomas! Margaret, you need to come quick. There's been an accident at Price's Mill, a bad one. They rushed down to town to find chaos. Price's Mill, the massive structure that had dominated Silver Creek's waterfront for a decade, was partially collapsed. The damage was catastrophic. Machinery destroyed, timber scattered like matchsticks, and worst of all, men trapped in the wreckage. Without hesitation, Thomas began organizing rescue efforts. Patrick, get every strong back you can find. Margaret, we need medical supplies, bandages, everything. Someone ride for the doctor in Cedar Falls. Even Price's workers who'd remained loyal joined the rescue efforts. The artificial divisions that Price had cultivated meant nothing in the face of human suffering. Margaret worked alongside Eleanor Patterson, who'd returned to town after her divorce, both women putting aside their history to tend the wounded. They worked through the night, pulling men from the wreckage, treating injuries, comforting the traumatized. By dawn, the full scope of the disaster was clear. 3 dead, dozens injured, and Price's mill completely destroyed. Edward Price himself was found in his office, uninjured but in shock, staring at the ruins of his empire. It was the dam, someone explained to Thomas and Margaret. He reinforced it to cut off even more water to your operation. But the spring runoff was stronger than usual, and the pressure built up. When it burst, the flood took out the mill's foundation. Price had literally engineered his own downfall, his attempt to destroy Thomas's operation resulting in the destruction of his own. Margaret approached him where he sat in the mud, a blanket around his shoulders, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. Your men need you, she said quietly. Whatever else has happened between us, they need leadership now. Price looked up at her, his eyes hollow. Leadership? I've lost everything. The mill, the money to rebuild, the respect of the town. What leadership can I offer? The kind that admits mistakes and tries to make amends, Margaret said. The kind that puts people before pride. Why do you care? Price asked bitterly. After everything I've done to you, why would you care what happens to me? Margaret considered the question. Because hate is heavy, Mr. Price. I've carried it as far as I'm willing to. You rejected me, tried to destroy us, and caused immeasurable harm. But you also set me on the path to find Thomas, to build something meaningful, to become who I really am. I can't forgive everything, but I can let go of the anger. She left him there, returning to the wounded who needed her help. But her words seemed to have reached something in him. Over the following days, as the town rallied to help the victims of the mill collapse, Edward Price did something unexpected. He apologized. Not a grand gesture, but small, individual apologies to workers he'd mistreated, to businesses he'd squeezed, to Margaret and Thomas for his campaign against them. He liquidated his remaining assets to pay his workers their owed wages and provide for the families of those killed in the collapse. I don't expect forgiveness, he said at a town meeting a week after the disaster. I've been a tyrant, driven by pride and greed. But I want to try to make amends if you'll let me. The town's response was mixed. Some were willing to forgive, others would never trust him again. But when he offered to work as a common laborer at Thomas's mill, to earn an honest wage doing honest work, Thomas made a decision that surprised everyone. Every man deserves a chance at redemption, Thomas said. You'll start at the bottom, earn your way up like everyone else. Can you handle that? Price, who'd once rejected Margaret for being too tall for his pride, nodded humbly. I can try. As September arrived, bringing with it the first hints of autumn, Margaret stood in her new workshop, larger now, employing 15 women and producing clothing that sold throughout Oregon. Through the window, she could see Thomas's mill running smoothly, the cooperative market bustling with activity, and the framework of new buildings rising throughout Silver Creek. The town that had laughed at her on that train platform had become home in the truest sense. She'd found love, purpose, and community, all because a small-minded man had rejected her for being too tall. Catherine, her first assistant, now a skilled seamstress in her own right, approached with a letter. "This just came for you, Mrs. Hale," from San Francisco. Margaret opened it to find an invitation to display her designs at a fashion exhibition with potential contracts from major retailers. It was an opportunity that would have seemed impossible a year ago. "Will you go?" Catherine asked excitedly. Margaret looked out at the town she'd helped transform, at the mill where her husband was probably working despite her telling him to rest his still tender leg, at the life they'd built from rejection and determination. "We'll go," she corrected. "Thomas and I together. It's time the world saw what Silver Creek can do when people stand tall together." That evening, as she shared the news with Thomas, he lifted her off her feet in a celebratory embrace, one of the few men who could do so, spinning her around their new kitchen while she laughed. "San Francisco," he said wonderingly. "My wife, the famous designer, taking on the big city." "Our designs," Margaret corrected. "Our business. Our future." As they stood together on their porch that night, looking out over the valley they'd fought so hard to claim, Margaret reflected on the strange journey that had brought them here. Edward Price's rejection had felt like the end of the world that day on the platform. Now she understood it had been the beginning of everything that mattered. "No regrets?" Thomas asked, echoing his question from months earlier. "One," Margaret said, and felt him tense beside her. "I regret that Edward didn't reject me sooner. Think of all the time we could have had together if I'd met you first." Thomas laughed, pulling her close. "Then we wouldn't have this story. The tale of the too-tall bride who conquered Silver Creek and the giant lumberjack who loved her. Is that what they're calling us now? Among other things, Patrick's composing a ballad. Fair warning, it rhymes height with fight an awful lot." Margaret groaned but smiled. Let them tell stories. Let them sing songs. She'd traveled 3,000 miles expecting to become a small man's proper wife. Instead, she'd become her own woman, standing tall beside a man who saw her height as just one more thing to love about her. The stars were bright above Silver Creek that night, and somewhere in the distance she could hear Patrick's Irish tenor beginning his ballad. Margaret Hale, once Collins, stood tall in her husband's embrace, finally exactly where she belonged. The train to San Francisco carried more than just Margaret and Thomas Hale. It carried the hopes of Silver Creek itself. Word of the fashion exhibition had spread through town like wildfire, and it seemed everyone had contributed something to ensure their success. The seamstresses had worked overtime to perfect the collection, the mill workers had crafted special crates to protect the garments, and even Edward Price, now working as a common laborer at Thomas's mill, had quietly donated fabric from his remaining personal stores. "You're nervous," Thomas observed as the California landscape rolled past their window. His large hand covered Margaret's where it fidgeted with the fabric of her traveling dress. "Terrified," Margaret admitted. "Silver Creek is one thing, but San Francisco? These are sophisticated buyers, worldly people who've seen fashion from Paris and New York. What if they laugh at my frontier designs?" "Then they're fools," Thomas said simply. "Your clothes are made for real women living real lives. That's rarer than all the Paris fashion in the world." The San Francisco exhibition hall was overwhelming in its grandeur. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and displays from designers Margaret had only read about in magazines. She felt conspicuously tall and plain among the elaborate presentations, her practical Oregon sensibilities suddenly seeming hopelessly provincial. Collins Hale Designs. A sharp-faced woman with a clipboard approached them. "You're in Space 27. You have 2 hours to set up before the buyers arrive." Their assigned space was small, tucked between two elaborate displays featuring mannequins draped in silk and velvet. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she began unpacking her designs. Sturdy, yet elegant dresses that could survive a day's hard work while still looking presentable for evening, split skirts that allowed women to ride horses or climb stairs without impediment, work wear that was both practical and flattering. "These are revolutionary," a voice said behind them. Margaret turned to find a well-dressed woman, perhaps 40, examining one of the split skirts with intense interest. She had the bearing of someone important, though Margaret couldn't place her. "I'm Sarah Morrison," the woman said, extending her hand. "I own Morrison's department stores, 12 locations from here to Seattle." Margaret's heart leaped. Morrison's was one of the largest retail chains on the West Coast. "Margaret Hale, this is my husband Thomas. I'm the designer. He manages our lumber operation in Oregon." Sarah Morrison's eyes traveled up to take in Margaret's full height, then Thomas's even more impressive stature. Instead of the usual discomfort or mockery, her expression showed interest. "You design for yourself," she observed, noting how Margaret's dress emphasized rather than hid her height. "That takes courage." "I design for women who work," Margaret replied, finding her confidence. "Women who need clothing that moves with them, that doesn't restrict or confine. Women who are tired of choosing between practicality and beauty." Sarah lifted one of the work dresses, examining the reinforced seams, the clever pocket placement, the way the cut allowed for full range of movement while maintaining an attractive silhouette. "Show me everything." For the next hour, Margaret presented her collection, explaining the thought behind each design. The adjustable hems that could accommodate different heights, inspired by her own struggles finding clothes that fit. The removable collars and cuffs that could be washed separately, extending the life of a garment. The hidden pockets large enough to be actually useful. "These aren't just clothes," Sarah said finally. "They're solutions. How quickly can you produce them in quantity?" "We have 15 seamstresses currently, with capacity to expand. But Mrs. Morrison, I should be clear. I won't compromise on quality for speed, and I won't exploit my workers for profit. They're paid fair wages, work reasonable hours, and share in the success of the business." Sarah studied her with those sharp eyes. "You run your business like your husband runs his mill, as a cooperative." "We've learned that when workers have a stake in success, everyone prospers," Thomas said, speaking up for the first time. "Radical ideas for radical clothes," Sarah mused. "I'll take your entire collection for my flagship store, with options for expansion if they sell well. Can you handle that without compromising your principles?" Margaret felt Thomas's hand squeeze hers in silent support. "We can, though we may need to bring some of Silver Creek's unemployed women into the business. Would that concern you?" "On the contrary, it would be a selling point. Clothing made by working women, for working women. I can market that." Sarah pulled out her card. "Have your lawyer contact mine. We'll draw up contracts that respect your cooperative model." After Sarah Morrison left, other buyers began approaching, drawn by the sight of the West Coast's most influential retailer spending so much time at their small display. By the end of the day, Margaret had orders that would keep her workshop busy for months and require significant expansion. "We did it," she breathed as they packed up that evening, orders tucked safely in Thomas's coat pocket. "You did it," Thomas corrected, pulling her into his arms right there in the exhibition hall, not caring who stared at the tall couple embracing among the mannequins. "You stood tall and showed them something they'd never seen before." They returned to Silver Creek to find the town gathered at the station, eager for news. When Thomas announced the contracts Margaret had secured, the celebration spilled from the platform into the streets. Even Edward Price, standing at the back of the crowd in his work clothes, applauded. The expansion happened quickly. Margaret hired 30 more women, including several from neighboring towns who traveled daily for the work. The cooperative model proved its worth. As profits increased, so did wages and benefits. The seamstresses could afford better housing, education for their children, even small luxuries that had been impossible before. Thomas's mill expanded too, drawn by contracts from Morrison's construction division. The success of both businesses began attracting other entrepreneurs to Silver Creek. A furniture maker set up shop, using Thomas's lumber and hiring local craftsmen. A restaurant opened to serve the growing population. The cooperative market expanded into a general store that competed directly with what remained of Price's old empire. It was at a town meeting in November, called to discuss incorporating Silver Creek as an official city, that the next challenge arose. Representatives from the Oregon Pacific Railroad had arrived with a proposition. "We're planning a new route through this region," the lead representative, a Mr. Cornelius, announced. "Silver Creek is one option, but we're also considering Millfield, 20 miles south. The town that offers us the best terms gets the railroad. A railroad connection would transform Silver Creek from a growing town into a genuine city. It would mean easier transport for lumber and clothing, access to broader markets, and an influx of new residents and businesses. It was the future, arriving on steel rails. "What terms are you seeking?" Mayor Watson asked. "Land for the station and yards, tax incentives, and," Cornelius's eyes found Edward Price in the crowd, "guarantee of lumber supplies at favorable rates." The old Edward Price would have seen this as an opportunity to regain control, to leverage his knowledge and connections. But the man who stood up was different, humbled, worn by labor, but somehow more solid for it. "The lumber decision isn't mine to make," Edward said quietly. "That would be up to Mr. Hale and Mr. Jacobson, who run the mills now, but I can offer something else. My expertise in negotiating with the railroad. I've done it before, in other towns. I know what they really want versus what they initially demand." The town hall went silent. Edward Price offering to help the community that he'd once tried to control through fear and economic pressure? It seemed impossible. "Why would you help us?" someone called out suspiciously. Edward's answer was simple. "Because Silver Creek is my home too. I've learned somewhat late that a rising tide lifts all boats. If the town prospers, we all prosper. If it fails, we all fail." Margaret stood. "I believe Mr. Price should be heard. Redemption isn't just a word. It's a process, and he's been working toward it. If his expertise can help secure the railroad, we should use it." Thomas nodded his agreement. "But it should be a community effort. Form a committee. Price for his expertise, Jacobson for established business, myself for the cooperative interests, and Margaret for the women's businesses that are becoming a major part of our economy. A woman on the railroad committee." Cornelius looked scandalized. "That's highly irregular." "So is a woman running a fashion empire from a frontier town," Margaret replied calmly. Yet Morrison's department stores seemed satisfied with the arrangement. "Would you like to see our quarterly revenue reports?" The numbers she presented made Cornelius's eyes widen. The combination of her fashion business and Thomas's lumber operation represented significant shipping revenue for any railroad. The committee was formed, and over the next weeks, they worked to present Silver Creek's proposal. Edward proved invaluable, knowing exactly where the railroad would compromise and where they wouldn't. His humility and deferring to others' judgment on key decisions showed how much he'd changed. "They'll want exclusive shipping rights," Edward explained during one late-night session. "Don't give it to them. They'll accept preferred rates instead, which leaves you room to negotiate with other lines later." The final presentation to the railroad board took place in Portland. Margaret wore one of her own designs, a striking navy suit that emphasized her height while projecting authority. Thomas stood beside her, their combined presence commanding attention before they even spoke. They presented Silver Creek not just as a town, but as a vision of the future. Cooperative businesses, innovative fashion, sustainable lumber practices, and a community that worked together rather than under the thumb of a single powerful interest. "Millfield offers us better immediate terms," Cornelius admitted after their presentation. "But Silver Creek offers something more valuable, growth potential. Your cooperative model, these fashion contracts, the lumber innovations, you're building something lasting." The railroad chose Silver Creek. The celebration that night was unlike anything the town had seen. The entire community gathered in the town square, dancing to Patrick's fiddle playing, sharing food and drink, rich and poor mingling freely. Margaret watched Edward Price dancing awkwardly with one of her seamstresses, his face lighter than she'd ever seen it. "Strange how things turn out," Thomas said, his arm around her waist as they watched the celebration. "You mean Edward?" "I mean all of it. If he hadn't rejected you, if you hadn't stayed, if we hadn't fought him, none of this would exist. The cooperative, the businesses, the community. His cruelty created the very thing he feared most, change he couldn't control." Margaret turned in his arms, looking up at her husband. "Do you think he understands that?" "I think he's beginning to." As if summoned by their conversation, Edward approached them, a glass of cider in his hand. He'd gained muscle from his work at the mill, lost the softness that wealth had provided. He looked healthier, more real. "I owe you both an apology," he said without preamble. "A real one, not the general ones I've been making. Margaret, I rejected you for the stupidest of reasons, because your height threatened my pride. That rejection led you to Thomas, led to all of this. I'm glad it worked out, but I'm sorry for the pain I caused. Margaret studied him for a long moment. Apology accepted, Edward. We all make mistakes. The measure is in how we correct them. Thomas, Edward continued, I tried to destroy your business, threatened your wife, acted like a tyrant. You would have been within your rights to run me out of town when my mill collapsed. Instead, you gave me work, a second chance. That's a debt I can never repay. It's not a debt, Thomas said firmly. It's community. We take care of each other here, even former enemies. Especially former enemies. They're the ones who best understand the cost of division. Edward nodded, emotion thick in his voice. The railroad will transform this town. You'll need experienced managers for the growth that's coming. If you'd have me, I'd like to help, not to lead, but to serve. To use what I know for the community's benefit, not my own aggrandizement. It was Margaret who answered. Silver Creek was built by people seeking second chances, Edward. Welcome to yours. As winter settled over the valley, the railroad construction began. The town transformed daily, new buildings rising, streets being paved, modern amenities arriving. Margaret's business expanded into a proper factory, though she maintained the cooperative model that had made it successful. She now employed over 100 women, with her designs selling across the country under the label Hale Heights, a name that celebrated rather than apologized for stature. Thomas's mill had become the largest employer in the region, but unlike Price's old operation, the workers shared in its success. The cooperative model had spread to other businesses, creating a network of mutual support that made Silver Creek unique among frontier towns. One December morning, Margaret stood in her office. She had an office now with tall windows overlooking the valley, reviewing expansion plans when Catherine knocked. Mrs. Hale, there's a woman here to see you. She says she's come from Boston, saw an article about your business in Harper's Magazine. The woman who entered was young, perhaps 25, and notably tall, not quite Margaret's height, but close enough to understand the challenges. Mrs. Hale, she began nervously, I'm Dorothy Mills. I've come all the way from Boston because I heard about what you've built here, a place where being tall isn't a curse, where women can work and prosper. I'm a seamstress, and I'm good. But in Boston, she trailed off, but Margaret understood. In Boston, you're a curiosity at best, an aberration at worst, Margaret finished gently. Here, you're just Dorothy. Can you start Monday? Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. Just like that? Just like that. We judge by skill and character here, not by how far your head is from the ground. As Dorothy left, overwhelmed with relief and possibility, Thomas appeared in the doorway. Another refugee from narrow-minded places? He asked. Another builder for our better world, Margaret corrected. How many does that make this month? 15 at least. Word spreading that Silver Creek is different, that people who don't fit elsewhere can build something here. Margaret rose and went to him, still having to look up slightly despite her impressive height. We're creating something important, aren't we? Not just businesses, but a different way of living. We are, Thomas agreed, pulling her close, though there's something else we might be creating. The way he said it, the gentle significance in his tone, made Margaret pull back to look at him. Thomas, the doctor confirmed it this morning while you were at the factory. Margaret, we're going to have a baby. Margaret's hand went to her stomach, wonder flooding through her. A baby. Our baby. Probably tall as a tree by age 5, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. Growing up in a world where that's celebrated, not mocked. Margaret thought of the journey that had brought her here. The rejection at the train platform, the struggle to establish herself, the fight against Price's tyranny, the building of something new and better. All of it leading to this moment, this future growing within her. I was so afraid that day Edward rejected me, she said softly. I thought my life was over. But it was just beginning, wasn't it? The best things often come from the worst moments, Thomas agreed. Our child will grow up in a town that chose cooperation over competition, acceptance over prejudice, standing tall over shrinking down. That evening, they announced the news at the monthly town dinner, another tradition that had grown from their cooperative movement. The cheer that went up could probably be heard in Millfield. Patrick immediately began composing a new ballad about the next generation of giants, while Mrs. Henshaw wept openly and began planning what she called the most magnificent baby blanket Oregon has ever seen. Even Edward Price, now a foreman at the mill and respected for his genuine transformation, offered congratulations. "That child will inherit a better world than any of us did," he said. "A world where being different isn't a flaw to be hidden, but a strength to be celebrated." As spring arrived in 1889, bringing with it the completion of the railroad connection, Silver Creek had transformed from a frontier lumber town into a thriving small city. The depot opening was a grand affair, with dignitaries from Portland and San Francisco attending. Margaret, now visibly pregnant but still working daily, stood with Thomas on the platform as the first official train arrived. Sarah Morrison emerged from one of the first-class carriages, come to see the source of her most successful clothing line in person. She surveyed the town, the bustling cooperative market, the modern mill, the factory where women streamed in and out, earning wages that would have been impossible elsewhere. "You've built something remarkable here," she told Margaret and Thomas. "Not just businesses, but a philosophy." "I've been thinking, would you consider expanding, opening operations in other towns, spreading this cooperative model?" Margaret and Thomas exchanged glances. It was tempting, the chance to extend their influence, to help other communities transform as Silver Creek had. "We'll consider it," Margaret said carefully, "but not until after the baby. And any expansion would have to maintain our principles: fair wages, shared ownership, respect for all workers regardless of their differences." "I wouldn't expect anything less from the woman who stood up to Edward Price and won," Sarah said with a smile. As the celebration continued around them, Margaret found a quiet moment to stand at the depot platform, the same type of platform where her story had begun with rejection and humiliation. Now she stood here triumphant, successful beyond her wildest dreams, her hand resting on her growing belly, while her husband's arm encircled her shoulders. "Regrets?" Thomas asked, their old question. "Not one," Margaret replied. "Every step, every struggle, every small victory led us here, led us to this." She gestured at the town spread before them, a place where the unusual was usual, where cooperation had conquered competition, where a too-tall woman and her giant husband were not oddities but leaders. A young woman stepped off the train, tall and uncertain, looking around with the same mixture of hope and fear that Margaret had carried 18 months ago. Margaret recognized the look, another refugee from places that demanded conformity. "Excuse me," the woman said, approaching them hesitantly. "I'm looking for Mrs. Hale. I heard she hires women who—" She gestured helplessly at her own impressive height. "You've found her," Margaret said warmly. "And yes, we're always looking for good workers. Height is an asset here, not a liability." As she led the newcomer into town, explaining the cooperative model, the opportunities available, the community they'd built, Margaret caught sight of their reflection in a shop window, three tall figures walking confidently down the main street of a town that celebrated rather than scorned their stature. The baby kicked, strong and insistent, and Margaret smiled. This child would never know what it was like to apologize for taking up space, to shrink themselves for others' comfort. They would grow up in a world where standing tall was not just accepted, but expected. 5 years had passed since that pivotal day at the train depot. Margaret stood once again on a platform, but this time at Silver Creek's grand new station, 3 times the size of the original. She held the hand of her daughter, Clara, who at 4 years old was already remarkably tall for her age, promising to inherit her parents' impressive stature. Thomas stood beside them with their son, little Thomas Jr., just 2 but already showing signs of his father's build. Around them, the town they'd helped transform bustled with life. The cooperative model had spread to neighboring communities, and Silver Creek had become a symbol of progressive business practices across the West. Edward Price approached them, his own family in tow. He'd married one of Margaret's seamstresses, a gentlewoman who'd seen past his history to the man he'd become. Their twin boys ran ahead, playing with Clara and Thomas Jr., all of them unconscious of the irony that Price's children and the Hale children were close friends. The new contracts from Morrison's came through. Edward reported in his role as business manager for the cooperative. They want to feature Hale Heights as their exclusive fashion line for working women. National distribution. Margaret nodded, pleased but not surprised. The business had grown beyond her wildest dreams, but more importantly, it had maintained its principles. Every worker owned shares, wages were triple the national average, and they'd established a fund to help other women start their own cooperative businesses. "There's something else," Edward added, a strange smile playing at his lips. "A letter came for you, Margaret, from Boston." He handed her an elegant envelope. Inside was an invitation. The Boston Fashion Academy, where she'd once been rejected for being too unconventional, was inviting her to give the keynote address at their annual symposium. "They want you to speak about revolutionary design for the modern woman," Thomas read over her shoulder, grinning. "How things change." "Will you go?" Edward asked. Margaret looked at her family, at the town square where a new statue had just been unveiled. A figure of a tall woman standing proud, commissioned by the town council to commemorate Silver Creek's transformation. She thought of all the women who'd found refuge and opportunity here, all the families supported by fair wages, all the children growing up in a world where difference was celebrated. "We'll all go," she decided. Let Boston see what became of Margaret Collins, the too tall bride they once pitied. Let them see what's possible when people stand tall together. As the sun set over Silver Creek, painting the mountains gold, Margaret reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. Edward Price's rejection had seemed like the end of everything, but it had been the beginning of more than she could have imagined. She'd come to Oregon to find a husband and had found so much more: love, purpose, community, and the courage to be exactly who she was. The woman who'd stepped off that train in 1887, desperate for acceptance, had transformed into someone who defined acceptance on her own terms. "Mama," Clara said, tugging at her skirt, "why is that statue so tall?" Margaret knelt down to her daughter's level, though even kneeling she was impressively tall. "Because, my darling, sometimes being tall means you can see farther than others. You can see past what is to what could be. And when you stand tall, really tall, others can see that possibility too." "Like you and Papa?" "Like all of us," Margaret corrected, gesturing at the diverse crowd in the square. Tall and short, rich and poor, native-born and immigrant, all building something together. When we all stand tall in our own ways, we lift each other up. Thomas reached down and lifted Clara onto his shoulders, her delighted laughter ringing across the square. Thomas Jr. demanded equal treatment, and soon Margaret had him on her own shoulders, the family towering above the crowd like a monument to the power of refusing to shrink. Patrick's fiddle struck up a familiar tune, the ballad he'd written about Margaret and Thomas, now a town favorite. As the music played and the community gathered to dance in the square, Margaret remembered that day on the platform when she'd thought her height had cost her everything. Instead, it had given her the world. Edward Price had rejected her for being too tall, calling her an aberration, a mistake. But mistakes, Margaret had learned, were often just opportunities in disguise. Her height hadn't been a flaw to overcome, but a strength to celebrate, a banner to rally others who'd been told they didn't fit the mold. The telegram from Boston had called her a pioneer of fashion and social reform. The railroad executives referred to Silver Creek as the miracle of the Oregon frontier. But Margaret knew better. There was no miracle, no magic, just people choosing to stand tall, to support each other, to build something better than what they'd inherited. As the stars emerged over Silver Creek, Margaret Hale, tall, proud, and unapologetic, danced with her giant husband while their children played with the children of former enemies, in a town that had learned to measure worth not by inches or dollars, but by character and community. She'd traveled 3,000 miles to marry a stranger, only to discover that the stranger she needed to meet was herself. And in meeting that tall, strong, capable woman, she'd helped others meet themselves too. The mail-order bride who'd been rejected for her size had found her perfect match, not just in Thomas, but in a whole community that had learned to see difference not as a threat, but as a gift. And in the end, that was the greatest love story of all, not just between two tall people who found each other, but between a woman and the town that learned to stand tall together. The story that had begun with rejection on a train platform had become legend throughout the West. The tale of Margaret Collins, the too-tall bride who'd refused to shrink, and the town that grew to match her stature. But here in Silver Creek, she was simply Margaret Hale, mother, businesswoman, wife, friend, and living proof that sometimes the best things in life come not from fitting in, but from standing out and standing tall.